Hello and welcome to the 92nd Street Y New York's 6th State of America Summit. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO of the 92nd Street Y New York. We've begun the 2024 election cycle with critical primaries starting to roll out across the country at every level of government, leading up to the presidential election in November. This election will determine the future of our country and the shape and contours of our democracy. At the 92nd Street Y New York, this year is also an important year for us, as it's the year in which we're celebrating 150 years of culture, civic engagement, and conversations with New Yorkers and people from across the world. As we turn 150, we remain committed to gathering people both in person and virtually around the globe for civil civic discourse. Events such as the State of America Summit are a reminder of how critical our work is as a cultural institution and as a trusted convener of important conversations. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us today for the discussions that will be occurring during this timely event among some of the most influential and inspiring voices in American politics, public policy, advocacy, and academia. In them, we'll tackle important topics including the politicization of public education, immigration policy, the role of the Electoral College, the future of the Republican Party, the dangers posed to democracy by misinformation, and the ongoing fight over policies relating to reproductive health. Before we dive into today's program, I want to express our gratitude to the State of America's lead sponsor, Craig Newmark Philanthropies. Craig Newmark Philanthropies' very generous contribution makes today's summit possible, as well as the Newmark Civic Life Series, which brings the leading minds from across the United States and around the world together at 92NY for civic engagement relating to the future of democracy. And now, let's start today's event. Thank you again for engaging with us, and thank you for tuning in.
Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. I'm the lead sponsor of the Newmark Civic Life Series at the 92nd Street Y, New York. As we get closer to this year's election, we all got to understand the pivotal role we're all going to play in helping shape the future of our communities, the future of our nation, and the future of the globe. We need to do what it takes to restore decency, to restore dignity, and to restore trust in our democratic institutions and society. Getting civically engaged is the first step. Becoming civically engaged is the best way to be a patriot for real in 2024. How do you do that? I got a few suggestions for you. Seriously, check your voter registration. Sometimes things go wrong. Then help your friends and family check theirs. It's a big deal to vote in local elections that include school board, city council, and judicial positions. They all matter. And it's always a good idea to go to the extra step, sign up to be a poll worker. I'm committed to continuing the partnership between Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the 92nd Street Y in New York. The deal is to bring you trustworthy and transparent pro-democracy content. Delivering accurate and nonpartisan information is crucial to building a healthy and well-functioning democracy, and we all got to do that to protect the country as genuine patriots. I can't think of a better forum than 92nd Street, New York's State of America Summit. Today's program takes a genuine look at what's at stake in our upcoming elections, from immigration to public education to access to reproductive health care. You're doing your part to protect our country as for real patriots by strengthening our democracy by joining us here today. And I'm proud to be involved in the State of America Summit to enlighten and inspire you, the next generation of defenders of democracy, serious patriots. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Haynes, and I'm editor-at-large for The 19th, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender and politics. I'm so excited today to join the State of America Summit to discuss a topic that we've been covering heavily in our newsroom: how reproductive rights are shaping elections. So today I'm joined by New York State Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas, a member of the Democrat Working Party's family, whose district includes the communities of Astoria, Corona, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Woodside in Queens County. Jessica has represented the 34th Assembly District since 2021, and prior to running for office, she served in leadership for 13 years at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm also joined by Olivia Juliana, an abortion rights activist, democracy organizer, and political influencer from Houston, Texas. Olivia came to national prominence for initiating the takedown of a whistleblower website that targeted those in the state of Texas who helped in abortion access after the passage of the state's SB2 legislation, and for raising $2.2 million for abortion funds after she was publicly attacked by Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Welcome, Olivia.
Very excited to be here.
Well, as both of you know, abortion is on the ballot, and there has been a tidal wave of legislation that has been unleashed in Republican states in the 2 years since the Dobbs decision. And Americans across the country are fighting to protect abortion access, and that includes at the ballot box. So I want to just start by asking a few questions about what this means for the health and rights of American women and how it has affected how politicians campaign, how voters respond. I think I will start with you, Jessica, and just ask, I mean, this is the first presidential election since the fall of Roe, and the first opportunity for voters across the country to weigh in on this issue nationally. How do you see the fight for abortion already shaping up in the 2024 election?
Well, as we know, abortion is actually an issue that many voters support. My time at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, we work directly with Latino communities that are a growing electorate. And we understood that when we asked the right questions, when we said, would you support a loved one when making the decision around an abortion, 89% of Latino voters said yes. So this is a very important issue across the spectrum of race. It's largely a women's issue, but across gender as well. We find many communities that stand up and support abortion rights. And as we've seen, when abortion has been on the ballot, as a ballot measure, it's passed and it's garnered a lot of support. So even in conservative states, we've seen abortion continue to be popular amongst voters. Unfortunately, we don't see the elected officials sitting in the seats of those states where they're, exercising the will of their people and their constituents. But in terms of a voter issue, it is something that is very popular. I represent New York State. It's obviously something that's very important to us across New York. And that showed up in a recent election with Swazi, who ended up taking the seat that George Santos was, removed from. So abortion, again, continues to be popular as a campaign issue, and we continue to see voters show out and show up in support of abortion access.
Absolutely. Olivia, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say abortion is in the top 3 important issues of most Americans who are going to the ballot box, in particular young Americans. In the 2022 midterms, we were constantly told that there was going to be this huge red wave that occurred in the House of Representatives, and what ended up happening is Republicans did secure a majority, but it was only by 5 seats, which for a sitting incumbent Democrat president who had control of both chambers is very, very uncommon in this time period that we're in. And that largely is in part because of abortion. I have the stats here in front of me. Young people said that that was the top issue that influenced their vote in the 2022 midterm. So for some of these elections that we look at that happened, in Michigan, you had Gretchen Whitmer, who ran on repealing the state's pre-Roe abortion ban. Her opponent was endorsed by Right to Life, and Gretchen Whitmer beat her by 10 points, a larger margin than she originally won her first election by. Josh Shapiro ran on saying that he would veto anti-abortion legislation in the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania. He strongly defeated his opponent. Tony Evers in Wisconsin defeated his anti-abortion opponent. And so it's not just the ballot initiatives we've seen that have passed fantastically in states like Ohio and Kansas and Kentucky, but it's the elections that we've seen follow that in 2022 and in 2023, in particular in Kentucky with Andy Beshear. And Kentucky with Andy Beshear, if you look, the abortion referendum that had been on the ballot, the counties where it was successful align almost perfectly with the county breakdown of how Andy Beshear won re-election. So statistically, it's shown very clearly that abortion is an issue that people are voting about and they're going to the polls for. But also the point I think that's really important to make is the reason why Joe Biden was able to win in 2020 is because he greatly changed the electorate. If you look at the breakdown of who voted in 2016 versus who voted in 2020, if Joe Biden had not been able to expand the electorate, he would have either won by a very much slimmer margin than he did, or he would not have won at all. And that was largely part due to young voters. And I think that that's what we're starting to see continue to play out of the electorates are changing, not just at a national level, but on a state level and a local level as well, particularly because of the issue of abortion.
Absolutely. And listen, that electorate, it sounds like, whether we're talking about president or whether, as both of you mentioned, these down ballot races, whether that's governor or whether that is for a member of Congress, there is an expectation from the electorate that, they want to know where these candidates stand on this issue in particular. That feels certainly like something relatively new in our politics and really maybe even an effect of this post-Dobbs reality, that is something that's coming much, much more into focus for voters. Would you say, Olivia?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can think of two extremely clear examples of that, or three actually, in the Arizona Senate election in 2022, you had Blake Masters pull anti-abortion rhetoric off of his campaign website after the Dobbs decision because he knew it was unpopular, and he ultimately lost that election. And then you have Congressman Chris Deluzio is running for re-election. His current Republican opponent did the same exact thing. They pulled anti-abortion rhetoric that they had publicized off of their campaign websites because they know it's unpopular with voters. And in my home state here of Texas, we have Senator Ted Cruz, who is running for re-election, who has refused to answer questions about the woman who had to flee the state to get abortion care, Kate Cox, after the Texas Supreme Court ruled that she could not get access to care in the state. He was actively avoiding people asking him that question at the Capitol, has refused to answer in interviews, has refused to address it. And I would say that in large part is because Ted Cruz is up for re-election, and in 2018, he only won by 2 points. And as I said before, not only is being anti-abortion deeply unpopular, and people are demanding that politicians make their stance clear, but with the way that it has motivated people and changed the electorate, some of these candidates who were in the position where they've been able to be blurry on the issue, like Ted Cruz, they don't have a choice, because if they don't outwardly express their opinion, they run the risk of alienating their own base, which in Texas, the Republican base, the Republican Party of the state has taken a very strong anti-abortion stance. Cruz runs the risk of alienating them. And by not coming out to say I'm pro-choice, he's completely ostracized everyone in the Democratic Party. You are not going to see pro-choice independents voting for Ted Cruz, period, because of his inability to make his stance clear and his inefficiency to do anything of substance when it comes to reproductive health care for the state.
Well, we are already seeing, presidential candidates being asked about this issue. Assemblymember, I want to come back to you, and then we'll come back to Olivia to hear from both of you about how you think the presidential candidates are addressing this issue. What do you think their response has been, and what do you think voters think of the responses that these candidates are giving?
Well, I think it's clear the difference between the two candidates, or, the host of candidates, but the two top candidates. I do have to say, under President Biden, I've been invited to the White House on a number of occasions to meet directly with the vice president. She has demonstrated a real commitment to talking about reproductive justice, to bringing diverse players to the table. As a Latina elected in New York State, she gathered a number of other Latinas from around the country who were elected to various different states to talk about this issue. And then she also had another roundtable of women electeds that were diverse. And they've had conference calls and strategy meetings, and they really understand how critical this is in this country. And, you know, again, the vice president has been, I think, charged with doing some of this ground game and some of this work directly with state elected officials, which is really critical. But we have to make sure that we're ensuring that our, President Biden continues to really hold the line here. You know, I often hear some slippery language that we have to make sure that it's very abortion positive, and, you know, not the euphemisms of access to reproductive rights. It's really, we have to say the word abortion because it's something that we want to protect and eventually, you know, ensure that it is perhaps a law that we can then have it safe across the country. But it's really a difficult dynamic when the states are wildly different, the state legislators are wildly different. But again, the voters know that this is something that they care about. And I think, as Olivia said, we're starting to see elected officials backslide on their positions, but we have to make sure our president holds a line, stands strong on this issue.
Yeah, and Olivia, how would you rate the candidates on speaking about this issue on the campaign trail?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is period, or he's awful, just period. He is, and arguably in the modern era, the most anti-abortion president we've ever had. He is directly responsible for Roe v. Wade being overturned. And when it comes to messaging from the White House, I've also participated in several roundtables. I've met and spoken with both the president and vice president about the issue. And for me, I have two lanes of this, which I kind of view it from. I view it from an abortion rights activist lane, but I also view it from a political strategist lane. That's what I do professionally outside of activism work. And I understand people's frustration with the hesitancy to consistently say the word abortion. Mm-hmm. I completely understand that. And I will say that I think that we have made great progress in bringing that conversation to the forefront, where previously I don't think it would have been. But I also really appreciate the framing of freedom, because not only does it poll very well, but you know, bodily autonomy is not just about abortion access. It's also about the ability to conceive a family. Like we're seeing attacks now on IVF. We're seeing attacks on birth control. And I think that sometimes it can feel like when people are using the language of reproductive freedom, it feels like it's minimizing abortion. And what I try to get people to understand is I don't think it's minimizing abortion. I think it's bringing all those other points into the conversation as well. Because when Roe v. Wade was overturned, activists like myself, we were saying we knew this was coming, but what we need you to understand is it does not end here. There are two major cases on the docket for the Supreme Court this summer. One is relating to the Emergency Medical Labor Act in Idaho. They have a very extreme abortion ban that they're saying, and they're arguing that doctors don't have to provide you an abortion in an emergency instance. And we also have a case around medication abortion, where the Supreme Court is very likely going to put severe restrictions on abortion medication, which that's going to have an impact in all 50 states, because over 50% of all abortions in the United States are done through medication abortion. So I understand and I empathize, and I do agree with the point that I wish that Joe Biden was openly more pro-abortion, but I also understand with how complicated and broad and diverse of an electorate that we have to win in 2024 running against Donald Trump, why they might be hesitant to make those points in some instances. But I think we just have to point to the record of what they've done. Joe Biden has used executive action to protect abortion medication when it comes to the mail. They are saying, give me a filibuster-proof majority, or give me enough people to abolish the filibuster to codify abortion rights, and we will do it. And that's on the backing of all of the Democratic state elected officials who have fought to secure abortion rights in those states. So I really don't think that these two candidates could be any more different on the issue, because Joe Biden is actively saying, I think everyone should be able to make decisions about their own body. Abortion should be legal. And Donald Trump is saying, I'm the one who did that. I am the one who overturned Roe v. Wade. So.
Yeah, what I'm hearing both of you saying is that the messaging does matter, and the messaging could land differently with these different constituencies that frankly, President Biden would need to put together the coalition that he will need if indeed he is going to be reelected. So, I mean, just to build on this, I mean, Assemblymember, you talk about the work that you have done and still are doing with Latina voters. Olivia, I know you work so much with young voters. Who are we seeing really motivated by this issue that can make a difference, particularly in some of these battleground states where we know what we expect to be a very close election is going to be decided? Are we talking about young voters? Are we talking about voters of color? Are we talking about men? And could Republican women really make a different choice as a result of just what you were talking about, what they might see as a threat to their rights, their freedom, their liberty?
Well, I'll say women have registered and turned out at higher rates than their male counterparts throughout the last several years or maybe decades. So women are generally at the forefront of civic engagement. And one thing that's really important to know is that when you invest in a woman voter, you're investing often in their family, right? And making sure that their families are coming out to vote. It is all the communities you said, it is young people that are turning out that really are viscerally understanding and feeling the impacts of a post-Roe world. It is people of color. It is our Black voters that have consistently showed up as Democratic voters. And I get very frustrated when elected officials take that for granted. We cannot take any community for granted. So those are the people that are on the front lines. And as I said, even polling amongst men are very high in support of reproductive rights, but women consistently show up and show out in the polling box. And we're seeing more communities of color show up and show out. And again, it's our Black women that are saving the Democratic Party and have been doing that for so long. So again, it'd be foolhardy for anyone to take any of these communities for granted. In fact, we need to do additional investment. The one area I want to caution other elected officials, and we're seeing this in New York, people are not investing enough in our Asian Pacific Islander community and our Asian Pacific Islander voters. So in New York State, right, we are a very, very Democratic state. The Assembly is a body of 150 members, and about 102, I think we're at 102 right now, are Democrats. We got our two first Asian American Republicans just this past year. One is East Asian and one is South Asian. That is very concerning. And we're hearing more that Asians are turning to the Republican Party because they're not feeling seen or heard by the Democratic Party. So I've long been committed to elevating and supporting and working alongside my AAPI siblings in this fight for reproductive justice. They are in the forefront. I work long time with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, who are amazing. And they've been screaming for years saying, pay more attention to us. Pay more attention to us and invest, right? We need more language access. We need more targeted outreach. We need more engagement. And, I'm seeing the impacts of that not happening in New York, in New York. So that's something I want to underscore, that we need to make sure we're making those investments. And, by no means taking any other community for granted. It really means door knocking, outreach, phone calls, mail, all the things that allow voters to become informed and make sure that they're aware of early voting times and different, all the options, mail-in ballots, et cetera, so that we can make sure we have as many people as engaged as possible, reduce those barriers to get more folks at the voting boxes.
Yeah. Well, just to stay on kind of the topic of messaging, polling suggests that the economy remains a top issue for voters, although I will just say, there's no such thing as a single issue voter. But I do want to unpack what that means on the ground, particularly on the issue of abortion. Olivia, I'm going to come back to you and just ask, for people who don't understand, can you explain why abortion is also an economic issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, The overwhelming majority of individuals who choose to have an abortion are people who are low income or who are living in poverty. And there's already barriers in accessing abortion. It wasn't cheap to begin with, and now on top of that, if you're someone who is low income and you're living in a state like Texas, where now you have to travel out of state to go get that care, it's even more expensive, and it's even more inaccessible. And one of the largest things that is very rarely ever talked about by politicians when talking about abortion is people who feel the need to have abortions because they can't afford to have another child. The overwhelming numbers show that a lot of women who choose to have abortions already have multiple children. And when you listen to the stories from abortion storytellers saying, I had a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I could not afford to have another child because of the economy. I could not afford to have another child because childcare costs are through the roof, and because housing costs are through the roof. It's an economic issue in the way of it's expensive to attain one. It's expensive to travel, but it's also expensive to raise a family. Which is why I find such issue with Republicans in particular saying we are the family of or we're the party of family values, when they consistently fight to ban abortion, but also make it extremely inaccessible and expensive to have a family, to start a family, and to support your family once you have one. And so it's an economic issue on all of those fronts and more.
I'd love to add to that. I quote this all the time. Audre Lorde said, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives."
Yes.
And being in the reproductive justice movement for 13 years, we really understood that, gender justice is a reproductive justice issue. Economic justice is a reproductive justice issue. Immigrant justice is a reproductive justice issue. And I'm wearing pink today because I am the sponsor of a bill called One Fair Wage that ensures that restaurant workers who are paid a sub-minimum wage and often have to depend on tips to put, food on the tables of their own families we're trying to eliminate that sub-minimum wage. And back when I was at Latina Institute, we were involved in the fight for one fair wage because we understood viscerally that this is an economic justice issue. If you are working in a restaurant, if you experience sexual harassment in those restaurants because you have to, comply with the customers and get that tip that you need to survive, oftentimes they're not earning enough to even qualify to get, certain health care. And in other states outside of New York, if you're on Medicaid, you often can't get abortion care under Medicaid because of the Hyde Amendment. And I was part of an effort that continues on to repeal the Hyde Amendment. But, you look at these issues like how someone's job is preventing them from getting access to certain health care that would, prevent them to be able to, create the family they wish to create. And oftentimes abortion is out of their reach, and also having a family is out of their reach. So it is really, really truly an economic justice issue. And that's very centered to the reproductive justice framework.
Absolutely. I mean, both of you are illustrating so well, what we mean when somebody answers in a poll question, is the economy working for you or not? And for people who say, no, unpacking that, really hearing about some of the issues that are on the ground, abortion is often, and reproductive access is often part of that equation. Olivia, you brought up the Alabama Supreme Court decision that we saw in February, ruling that frozen embryos can be considered children under state law. And that's really thrown into question the legality of in vitro fertilization, shining a light on, kind of what some people saw as unanticipated or unintended. I don't think everybody thought about it that way. Consequences of the Dobbs decision, but I just wonder what both of you think, and I'll start with you, Olivia. What impact could really this just ongoing, uncertain, and fast-moving legal landscape continue to have on the election?
I mean, I think Kate Cox's scenario in Texas is a really good example of that. When we put criminal penalties on doctors if they provide abortion care, we are asking them to be medical professionals, and we are asking them to be lawyers. And that has created an extremely dangerous environment for people across the country, because now if you're someone who you need access to an abortion to save your life, the doctor now has to decide if they are going to give you access to that care, or if they're going to face criminal penalties. In the state of Texas, a doctor who provides an abortion can face up to 99 years in prison, and the threat of losing their medical license. And it creates this environment where now we are seeing post-Dobbs, the direct result is maternal mortality rates are going up. And that is not a coincidence. When you make it difficult for doctors to do their job, when you allow for people who are not lawyers to have to make decisions about the law, you are putting people's life at risk. And with this Alabama ruling in particular, we are continuing to expand the scope of how these Republican electeds are limiting the ability for people to make decisions about their own body. It has never been about just abortion, because now abortion is not constitutionally protected nationally, and they are attacking birth control. They are attacking IVF. They are going to continue to attack medication abortion. And this did not just start now either. You know, we've been seeing attacks on the Affordable Care Act for having insurance providers help people get access to birth control. And we're just seeing this kind of subtle testing of legal theory in different courts throughout the country. And the ultimate goal here is to limit people from being able to make any and all reproductive decisions about their own body. So I think that that's the biggest point we want to make. But the second point I want to make on getting people to understand this is not just a Supreme Court issue. The Supreme Court allowed for this to come up by overturning Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision. But what they are now essentially doing is all of these lower courts, there's over, I want to say 900 of them in the country, all of these lower court judges now have the ability to make rulings on abortion access, abortion medication, and bodily autonomy. And with court shopping, which is where different attorney generals and different attorneys will go find specific districts with specific judges that were appointed by Trump or other presidents, we have created and watched the creation of a court network that is dedicated to rolling back bodily autonomy. And the worst judge about that, I'll put everyone on alert, is Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk in the state of Texas. He is a Trump appointee who rolled back. He is the one that led to the Supreme Court hearing the mifepristone case by rolling back the FDA's ruling about that. And he also rolled back protections for minors to be able to access birth control. So it has never been about just the Supreme Court. It's about all these other lower courts as well. And we need to be paying attention to what rulings are coming from them and from the state courts going forward.
Absolutely. So we know the State of the Union is happening in just a couple of days, and Kate Cox, who you mentioned, Olivia, who had to travel outside of Texas to get an abortion to terminate that non-viable pregnancy, is an invited guest to attend the speech. I want to close by asking, I would think that would mean that reproductive rights will come up as an issue in President Biden's speech. But what do you think he needs to say? What are you listening for? And what will it mean if he doesn't mention this? Assemblymember, I'll start with you, and then we'll give Olivia the last word here.
Yeah, I actually was in the Dominican Republic doing a visit and a tour and on a delegation around reproductive rights to understand what it looks like to live under a full abortion ban. Mm-hmm. And that meant people die. And while I was in Dominican Republic, we were watching the Kate Cox dynamic and watching what was happening to her. And the similarities felt so real. And the sadness that she had to leave her state to get the care after going through this brutal legal process is unconscionable. So I think it's gonna be a powerful message. I hope Biden makes this a powerful message to have the voters understand what is at stake. We're already seeing this world that we feared. So many of us feared, anticipated, but feared. But this is what it looks like. A white woman with resources, who's already a parent, who looks like the perfect sort of candidate for that exception, had to leave the state to get the care that she needed. it's so critical to uplift that story, because in the world of exceptions, this would have been the right case, right? This is where she should have gotten the care that she needed. But as Olivia said, they are after everything. They are after all forms of reproductive health, reproductive rights, and bodily autonomy. And I think her story elucidates that and understands how far they will go to eliminate access to all forms of reproductive health care in this state. So I'm glad she'll be there, and I hope he really hammers this point to ensure that the American public understands what's at stake.
Yeah, I actually attended the State of the Union last year as a guest of Congresswoman Nanette Barragan. She's the chairwoman of the Hispanic Caucus. And I would undoubtedly expect President Biden to make the pro-choice argument and to make a point on what he's done to protect reproductive freedom. I trust that this administration, particularly because of what we have seen from the vice president, that not only are they going to make this a key focal point of their reelection campaigns, but that the president has the opportunity, I think he will take it, to highlight that a diverse coalition of people can still fight to support reproductive freedom. You know, Joe Biden is an old white man who is Irish Catholic, not traditionally the base of people who are pro-choice, pro-abortion. But he's a testament to the reality that is Americans are not divided on this issue. You know, I think it's 86% of Americans think abortion should be legal in some capacity. And I think that those 86% of Americans are exactly who Joe Biden is going to be talking to at the State of the Union. And I also think that inviting Kate Cox to begin with is a very strong signal that not only are they paying attention, but they're paying attention to people in every single state, including states like Texas.
Yeah. Well, I will absolutely be tuned in to see what it is that the president is going to say. It sounds like you both will as well. What a robust conversation, and helping us kind of think about how abortion is literally going to be on the ballot for millions of Americans this fall. So Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas and Olivia Juliana, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us think about this very important issue in such a consequential year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. So we'll get started. The future of immigration, it's on the minds, I think, of many voters, certainly on the minds of those running for office. So I'll start with our panel, Musafar and Sergio, if you can introduce yourselves. We'll start with Musafar.
Hi, I'm Muzaffar Chishti. I'm a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute.
Hi, I'm Sergio Martinez Beltran, and I cover politics and government for NPR's The Texas Newsroom, which is a collaboration of public radio stations in Texas and the network.
So we'll start with, I guess, maybe the broad state of play. Musafar, where are we, do you think, in terms of the broad state of play, dealing with both irregular or illegal migration and legal migration? Their fates are often tied together in legislation and direction from Washington. So where are we at the moment?
So that's a very good start, Alicia, because I think I tell people that my elevator speeches on immigration are getting shorter and shorter, that we actually have two crises of immigration in our country. One is that we actually need foreign-born workers in various sectors of our economy, from low wage to mid-wage to high-wage sectors. And we don't have an immigration system which can do that. We have an immigration selection system which was constructed in 1952 and has been tinkered with only 2 or 3 times, last time in 1990. So we allow only about 70,000 people among the million people that we take a year for green cards on the basis of the real labor market needs of the country. Now, that doesn't make sense to anyone. That has to be changed to respond to the needs of a 21st century global economy. But on the other hand, we have a real crisis at the border, which is that large number by our own estimates at MPI, 6.2 million people were encountered at the border during the Biden administration. About 300,000 people came just in 1 month in December of last year. Now that's a big number. And most of them are coming unauthorized, and most of them are coming seeking asylum. And people perceive this as an uncontrolled, unmitigated crisis. And that's true. So as people's perception, as long as we don't deal with the crisis of the border, there is no appetite for doing anything on legal immigration. So that's the twin dilemma that we are walking into the 2024 presidential election, which is, I think, going to be dominated by the politics of immigration.
Sergio, to that point, it's immigration, the border is dominating Texas politics at the moment. There's a lot going on in Texas, but this is, and tell me if I'm wrong, one of probably the top two issues at the moment. So what's the state of play in Texas?
I mean, immigration is in the minds of every voter, and poll after poll shows that it's the number one topic for Republicans in Texas. It's the number one or number two topic for Democrats, and I think Governor Greg Abbott here in Texas is responsible for that, right? He's been pushing for some of these laws that have, to be quite frankly, annoyed a lot of people, including governors in other states, including the White House. And so I think he's been very effective at making sure that immigration is at the top of mind of voters. And this is not something that happened just in 2024. He's been running on this issue for the last 4 or 6 years. It's just that he has amped up those tactics. Something that Muzaffar mentioned is that we saw record numbers of crossings in December. There was one area in Texas, the Del Rio sector, that in December saw an average of 2,300 daily migrant crossings. That was pretty high, and that's the highest that a lot of these organizations that are also working with migrants on the border have experienced. So we're also seeing that it's becoming political because the governor has made it very political, but also some of these border communities that for the longest time have tried to embrace migrants and have tried to stay away from the politicking of it all, are also starting to speak up and even side with the governor at times.
When we talk about the laws and the pressure Governor Abbott is putting on the border, what kind of dollars are we talking? The federal government has obviously spent many billions of dollars over the last 25 years. But what sorts of dollars are we talking about at the state level? What does the newest series of laws, I believe it's Senate Bill 4, what does that actually do? And are you seeing any impacts yet in Texas? And I'll add one more for you. Is Operation Lone Star, the governor's big state push, is it working? If you had 2,300 average daily apprehensions in the Del Rio sector, the Eagle Pass area in particular, 300,000 apprehensions border-wide in December, is it working? Does he think it's working?
Those are 3 great questions. I'm going to try to break them down. I think, to the first question of how much money are we spending, the state has spent at least $10 billion, that's billions with B, on Operation Lone Star. And that money has gone to deploy National Guardsmen to the border. It's gone to install razor wire along the U.S.-Mexico border, and also implement put buoys on the Rio Grande. That's part of where the money is going. We also got records recently that show that the state has also spent over $148 million in busing migrants who have been processed and released by the federal government. The state has put them on buses, and that has cost the state $148 million at least. And he's been sending them to other states like New York City, Illinois, Colorado, California. So it's costing a lot of money, and not only the federal government has spent billions, the state has also done the same. To the question of whether it's working or not, it depends who you ask. The governor would say that it is working, that he's being effective at curtailing illegal immigration, but the numbers don't show that, right? At the end of the day, we saw in December when a lot of these initiatives were already in place, we saw still the highest number of migrants crossing through the southern border. So it was not doing much to curtail illegal migration. What we did see is that we saw that migrants were getting hurt and injured because they were crossing through the concertina or under the concertina wire, and they were getting caught. We heard reports of people drowning because National Guardsmen were like pushing them back to the river. So it was not working. It was not curtailing illegal migration, and it was not deterring people from crossing. People were crossing and they were getting hurt. To the third question, of some of these laws or initiatives that the governor has put in place, SB4, like you mentioned, is I think the big one right now. That law does multiple things. It allows local and state police forces to detain and arrest anyone they deem to be in the country illegally. And if the person is in the country illegally, they get to take them to a magistrate judge, and that judge has been empowered under state law to order the migrants to return to Mexico, even if they don't come from Mexico. And this is significant because in the past we've seen laws that allow some sort of this, part of this law to play out, but it has to be close to the border. In this case, it can be anywhere. So it can be a police officer in Austin, we're not close to the border, that could stop someone who they think is in the country undocumented, and then go through that process. And so those things would happen under state law. Now that law has been challenged. The Department of Justice sued the state over SB4, and we're awaiting a ruling from a federal judge that can come anytime before the law goes into effect on March 5th.
And to Ms. Fart, we talk about this significant population, 6.4 million people encountered at the southwest border. Of course, that number isn't inclusive of those who've been allowed to stay. Title 42, the public health law prior to, I believe it was the middle of May of last year, many people were returned. But is there a sense of how many people are now in the workforce, effectively filling many of the open jobs in the U.S. and contributing sort of on the side, if you are on the slide, to the broader economy? Is this, in other words, is this a sort of back way to fill jobs within the U.S. economy without overhauling legal immigration?
Well, that's a good question, but it's kind of happened haphazardly. I mean, I think there are reports being issued that our GDP did go up, you could argue, because of the presence of new immigrants. 6.2 million did not come in, you're right. But we think maybe close to 4 million did. I mean, we have issued parole to 3 million people by now under the Biden administration. That includes Afghans, Ukrainians, Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans. So a large number of people have entered the country. Not all of them have work authorization, because even if you apply for asylum, you don't get work authorization for 6 months after the application. So many of them are compromising their ability to work. But if they're entering the workforce, it's not necessarily where we need the workers the most, because these people typically work then in the informal sector of the economy. They don't have work authorization. So it's kind of, in that regard, haphazard. There are no studies of how many people have actually entered the labor market, though we know many have. But, I don't want to forget the point that Sergio made, that this is not where we are in the polarized political world. This is a real crisis, as we must all acknowledge. And I think, to be completely nonpartisan here, I think the administration, including the president, took a long time just to acknowledge that we have a crisis. That it's kind of seen as if you use the word crisis, it's walking into to the Republican narrative. So if you don't agree on vocabulary, how can you agree on solutions? That's a real crisis. But there's also completely political motivation of the crisis. What Governor Abbott did in terms of busing people to the northeastern cities, that was all political stunt, just to teach lesson to the northeastern mayor. That's not to find a solution. What he's doing now to prevent Border Patrol from going to Eagle Pass, where asylum seekers may be camped so that they could be processed, that's straight, not just a spat. It's an open war about who has the authority to control the borders. Now, that is not just about immigration. That's a huge issue in federalism. So in this chapter in immigration, we have opened up the whole sort of the contentious issue about federalism. And in a way we haven't seen, I think, since the segregation days, when President Eisenhower actually had to send the national troops down to make sure that schools in Alabama could be desegregated. We're reaching that kind of a political crisis in this polarized world.
To that end, we've seen states and municipalities alike attempt to alter immigration law, at least in their territories. State of Arizona did it back in, I think, the early aughts. It was struck down by the Supreme Court. So what's next? I mean, is this the natural evolution? As you say, we're at war effectively over who gets to control the border. We saw these little pieces of this, Farmers Branch and I believe Hazleton, Pennsylvania, say, hey, you can't rent here if you don't have legal status, and tightening that loop on just being able to exist in a community. This is different. So is this the next evolution of that? And where does it go from here, given what we've seen in Washington and the collapse of the bipartisan Senate bill?
Exactly. So as you know better than anyone else, immigration was seen as an almost exclusive federal business till 1996, from Reconstruction to 1996, that states and localities have no role. It started changing in 1996 when Congress authorized states and localities to get engaged in immigration enforcement with 287G agreements. But we did not see a big rise in that engagement till 2005 or 2006. So this is in many ways a post 9/11 phenomenon, because sort of the deference that states and localities should be involved in immigration came as a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission. So it is that there's a huge national security component to this. But the culmination of it, you're right to remind our listeners, was in Arizona. So Arizona was like the ground zero of immigration in the first decade of the century. I'm arguing that Texas has now become the ground zero of immigration in this era. Governor Abbott is taking the mantle from Arizona. Supreme Court struck down most important elements of the Arizona 1070 law, which would have authorized, similarly to the Texas law, authorized state crimes, allowed local police to arrest people. I think many of us believe that Governor Abbott has pushed the legislature to pass SB4 so that there is another opportunity to revisit the same issue, but in a differently recomposed court. That they are thinking that by the new appointment of the Supreme Court, they will get a different outcome. Whether that will happen or no, we obviously don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical. I think this administration has been generally showing deference to federal authority on immigration, especially the Chief Justice, but you never know with the votes in the Supreme Court.
If I may add
in terms of Texas, what is Texas's approach? Has Governor Abbott said anything about Arizona and wanting a new ruling?
I mean, certainly SB4, everyone who supported SB4 did it knowing that this could end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And that has been their goal since day one. I was going to say that, I sat in this, in the oral arguments of SB4 in the federal courthouse in Austin. And federal judge David Ezra, he was appointed in 1988. He said he's seen a lot, and we believe him, right? He's seen it. He's seen a lot, and he had been appointed to California at some point and Arizona at another point. And it was interesting to sit in that courthouse because we started seeing how this judge, who at the beginning of his remarks said that he was sympathetic to Governor Abbott's concerns about the border, he still pushed back on the state's claim that Texas was being invaded by migrants, right? And that's one of the main arguments the state is making as of why we need SB4, because they say that the state is being invaded by migrants and the federal government is not doing anything, so the state can defend themselves. But Judge Ezra pushed back on that. He also pushed back on this idea that SB4 is complementary to federal law. it pretty much like it goes in the way of federal law, of immigration law. And so, you know, to Muzaffar's point, I who knows what could happen in the U.S. Supreme Court, right? But I think I'm a little skeptical too, because we're seeing federal judges on the lower level that are, you know, that have given Texas a win in the past on immigration, like Ezra, that are seeing that SB4 is like crossing the line in a way.
Given where the Senate bill collapsed, which was along party lines, Republicans, you know, for various and sundry reasons, and we'll leave that to others to suss out, but various and sundry reasons said absolutely not. The House said, I believe the Speaker Johnson said, dead on arrival. And that bill was viewed by many, including the Border Patrol Union, which is not particularly liberal or left-leaning, as at least a good start. With its fate apparently sealed, at least for this term, to either of you, does this appear that immigration reform, if there is such a thing to come in the next year or so, is this going to be handled by the court? Is this instead of executive fiat, a sort of judicial directioning?
Well, you know, I think this demise of this border security bill is a poster child of how dysfunctional our political system and Congress is. Here was exactly the things that Republicans have been seeking for years, that we need control over the border. This was an unusually good bipartisan work by a bunch of well-meaning senators with blessings of the Senate leadership. And then when they finally had a real deal, they got an order from ex-President Trump that he doesn't want a solution, because he would rather have a crisis to work to campaign on in the presidential election than to have a real outcome. So I think it collapsed under the weight of 2024 politics. There are some attempts to revive it. I doubt it, but I think there will now be enough pressure for the administration to do something on its own. So you will have probably elements of the same bill in executive actions, which to me means probably raising up the standard for initial screening of asylum. It may mean even triggers for when asylum is shut down, like if there are more than a certain number of people crossing, some of the elements which were in the bill. And hopefully it may even mean that new cases from the border on asylum should be sent to asylum officers as against immigration judges, because that court system is so backlogged that sending more cases to a backlog system is definition of insanity. So if we do that, then cases could probably be processed in months as against years, and then you may see a dent. I think the president is really in a dilemma on this. He needs a real story that he is working on the crisis of the border. And we had an election in New York, in Congressional District 8, where immigration was a central issue, and the Democratic candidate, Tom Suozzi, got the narrative right, that there is a crisis and we have mechanisms to deal with it. And that's, I think, what Democrats will be under pressure to carry to the campaign, and the Republicans will continue to say that this is a Biden border crisis. They literally call it that, as if it's one word. It's BBC, and they will champion that till we finish the election. But I don't think that issue is going to the courts anytime soon. To answer your question directly,
to the political side of this question, as you pointed out, Republicans got what they said they wanted, and then decided not to go forward with this bill. In Texas, the numbers of apprehensions have dropped dramatically, be it because of Texas. The U.S. law has not changed, but what has changed is in Mexico. Is there any sort of sigh of relief at the moment in Texas of this could help, a bill could help, an executive action could help, or is this another we demand, but we don't want that thing, we want the thing we said we wanted, but a little bit differently? And in other words, does the goalpost keep moving in the politics in Texas?
It does. I've been talking to some of the state lawmakers or Republican state lawmakers for some reporting on immigration, and I asked a few of them recently, hey, with the failure of the Senate bill, what happens then now? Like, did you think that was going to help your efforts here? And the people that I talked to, they said, you know what? We don't need more laws. We just need to enforce the laws that we have in the country. But right in the past, they wanted additional laws, and in fact, Texas is implementing additional laws that to try to alleviate the issue. I do think though that NGOs, organizations that are helping migrants along the border, are the ones who are feeling more relieved, and that is because they're seeing those numbers fall significantly. I recently talked to the Valverde Border Coalition in Del Rio, Texas, and they are one of those organizations that receive migrants and help them navigate the city and the next steps. And they told me that December was super hectic, and then in February, they're seeing it's quiet. It's fairly quiet compared to what they saw in December. So some of the organizations are the ones that are feeling that the numbers are dropping, and it feels a little bit more calm for them. But like you mentioned, Alicia, it's not necessarily the actions of Texas, it's the actions of Mexico on the other side of the border.
And I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions here, but to either of you, in terms of the legal immigration system, as far you described earlier, we're really dealing in a 1952 sort of scenario of available slots, if you will, for legal immigration, about 70,000, I believe, green cards every year, or work visas in the sort of higher end of this puzzle. But what's needed, and do you see that coming? Will that happen? Again, I hear from companies all the time flooding my inbox saying, hey, all of these people, why can't I hire them? We have cities asking specifically, Topeka, Kansas, saying, come on down. If you have a work permit and you can contribute to our economy, come on down. But there aren't that many people with work permits, and again, not in the levels of jobs that the U.S. apparently needs. So what's the future there?
So I'm so glad you asked me, and this is not prompted. We just issued a brief on this yesterday. It's kind of our ideas of reforming the employment-based immigration system. It's called the bridge visa. We have thought about this for a long time, and we decided to release it yesterday because we think there may be now after the collapse of the border bill until election, there may now be space for people to look for other ideas. So this basically argues that, look, we haven't become a xenophobic country. Let's sort of reassure all our viewers. We took 1.2 million people with green cards last year. In that regard, Biden should get huge credit. We are now back to pre-COVID, pre-Trump normal legal immigration. 1.2 million. Of those, given the structure of our law, only about 140,000 visas are allowed for people on actual labor market needs. This is what we call them. When I use 70,000, 140 also include the spouses and kids. So of those people, so actually in reality, only 70,000, and they're almost all going to high end of the occupations. In fact, our analysis,
to be clear, these are not green cards.
These
are work visas, H-1Bs.
Yeah, but no, the 70,000 are green cards. But the people getting those green cards are migrating from the H-1B category. So to have a foothold for these 70,000, you must be in an H-1B category, which is now occupied by high end and hugely by computer occupations. So if you don't come within the computer occupations, for the rest of our work world, the opportunities are extremely limited. So we're asking that we should have a bridge visa which bridges temporariness and permanence, because it's nonsense to call these people temporary workers. They're not temporary. And on the other hand, we should bridge occupations from low skill to high skill. And we should allow people to be sponsored in the country by an employer, test the labor market that US workers are not being displaced. They should be allowed to come for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, they have a choice. They could have 3 more years, or they could go back to their countries and may come on another bridge visa years later. We believe that people's idea of coming to America has radically changed. Not everyone wants to come to this country to retire here. They just want to come and work and be able to travel. This will allow that. Circularity of migration would become a reality. At the end of 6 years, people would have decided to work with a green card. But more importantly, the number of people that we admit, which is now frozen in a 1990 figure, should be flexible. That should be changed every 2 years, not by members of Congress, but by an independent body. Like the Federal Reserve changes interest rates every quarter. These are real experts who we think something similar should happen in immigration, so that if we increase numbers, have circularity, have flexibility, then we have a workable system. And to surprise to you, we actually got calls from 2 senators' offices yesterday saying, could we talk? So I can already say—
Can you tell us who they were?
No. But some other time I might. But they were bipartisan. So there is appetite for doing something on immigration, which is, I think, quite healthy.
And Sergio, do you see that appetite in Texas? Texas is a massive state. They are not immune to low unemployment, and their beneficiaries, obviously, the entire country has a low unemployment rate, but a lot of jobs still open. Are you seeing any sort of, from your delegation or the delegation you cover, any possible movement on that? Can these things be separated? Can the border be separated from legal migration in what you're seeing in your sphere?
I think it could, and we've seen it in the past, but in the current political environment, I think it's really hard, at least in Texas, right? I think about when Governor Rick Perry was in charge in Texas and he pushed for a guest worker program. And that's something that we're not even talking about in Texas nowadays, right? We're talking about other things and more focus on the border instead of like what happens then and how can we fill these jobs. So I think in this political environment, at least locally, there's not a lot of appetite for that. But, I think if we have some Congress members that have the appetite, I think that could change certainly the tone here.
Okay, I think we are about out of time. So I will say thank you to both of you for bringing your expertise. When I am asked about immigration and its future, I often say it's really complicated, and I try to go the other direction. So I appreciate the fact that you guys have not said that. You have not taken the cheap answer and turned and run. So we appreciate it. Thank you both very much for your time and your explanations of what's happening.
Thanks for having us.
Hello and welcome to the 92nd Street Y's 2024 State of America Summit. Today we're going to be talking about attacks on public education and democracy. I'm Rachel Pereira, a fellow in the Brown Center on Education Policy at Brookings, and I'll be today's moderator. I'm joined by 3 distinguished panelists, and together we'll discuss the state of public education in the U.S. To set the stage for today's discussion, it's worth stepping back to consider the acute challenges facing public education in the U.S. today. The COVID-19 pandemic had a profound impact on children and young people, as well as our public education system. We know that children's emotional well-being and mental health suffered during the pandemic, as well as their social and emotional development. And according to a number of studies, students are falling behind academically. The fallout from the pandemic has been far more pronounced for Black, Latinx, and Native American students, as well as students from low-income backgrounds, students with disabilities, thus exacerbating underlying educational inequalities that predated the pandemic. And so we're in a moment where the need for a high-quality public education for all is great. And yet public school systems are facing a number of simultaneous challenges in meeting those needs. Public schools are facing significant budget shortfalls as federal pandemic relief aid runs out later this year, shortfalls that will almost certainly be worse in states that have passed universal or near universal voucher programs that are further draining resources from public schools. Public schools have also been embroiled in a number of sharp political conflicts over what gets taught in schools and what materials and books children have access to in school buildings. Some 18 states have passed legislation limiting students' exposure to issues of race and racism, in the US in both the contemporary and historical context. And a number of states are debating expanding that limitation to limit conversations around gender identity and sexual orientation. Book bans are on the rise, as are attacks on schools, teachers, librarians, and libraries. And the teacher workforce is in a state of crisis. Teachers are burnt out. Some areas of the country are facing severe teacher shortages, and the teacher pipeline is weakening. In today's conversation, we'll consider how we got here, how the pandemic contributed to numerous crises facing public schools, and what different groups can do to strengthen public education. Today, I'm joined by three leading experts on education reform and policy and education law. We have Dr. Diana D'Amico-Paulez, who's a historian of education reform and school policy and an associate professor in the Educational Foundations and Research Program at the University of North Dakota. She's the author of many articles and books, including the award-winning book, Blaming Teachers, Professionalization Policies, and the Failure of Reform in American History. We are also joined by Dr. Sonia Douglas, who's a professor of education leadership and vice chair of the Department of Organization and Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Douglas is the author of numerous articles and books, including, most relevant for the current conversation, The Politics of Education Policy in an Era of Inequality, Possibilities Toward Democratic Schooling. We're also joined by Bob Kim, who's a leading expert in education law and policy in the United States and the executive director of the Education Law Center. In 2020, he served as a member of the Biden-Harris presidential transition team. And from 2011 through 2016, he served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Kim writes extensively on a wide range of legal and policy issues impacting public schools, including his book, Elevating Equity and Justice, 10 U.S. Supreme Court Cases Every Teacher Should Know. Thank you all. I'm really excited for this conversation, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all. So Diana, I'd love to get started with you and hear your perspective as a historian of education reform and policy. How did we get here? What are the historical trends that you see as contributing to our current state of public education in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. I mean, some of the things that I think about with a question like this is public schooling in this nation is old, right? So we're dealing with a very old system here. Early in this nation, we have folks calling for public education, and early on, we have folks adamantly opposed to it, right? This idea of big government. So these hesitancies around public education are baked in really early on, right? Feeling like we're infringing on parental rights, we're infringing on local rights. This changed, or the debate shifted a bit in the 1860s when we see folks like Horace Mann and others in the midst of a shifting social landscape, right? We have a significant influx of immigrants. And at this point, people begin to cast public education as this social solve, right? Through public education, we can confront all of these other social dilemmas that really cause us quite a bit of panic and fear. And so from very early on, this idea that public schools can solve social troubles has been baked into how we think of public schooling. After the Second World War, that framework definitely persists, but it changes. And there's a new element added to this idea of public schooling as this panacea. And that is this potent mixture of fear and politics, right? And so it's at this time where it's not just that schools are this critical line of defense in our national security and our social well-being, but also the kids are in danger. And we need schools to protect them, but maybe it's also schools that are putting them in danger. And so there's this like faceless enemy thing, right? Whether it's communists or it's this idea of failure or it's kids in poverty or it's whatever it is, right? It changes over time. But one of the things that happens very early on after the war is politicians immediately recognize the political power in this discourse of fear. And it becomes a shorthand, right? So the kids are in danger. You're going to have all kinds of folks, listening right away. And this becomes a way to mobilize voters, to raise funds, and to do all kinds of things in the name of panic, right? Concern over schools. And so one of the things I do want to note is that this kind of politicization around schooling, and particularly the use of fear, it's a bipartisan tool, right? It's something that we definitely see the right has fine-tuned quite a bit, but we also see the left, right? When we have, when Lyndon Johnson is passing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it's kind of, one of the rationales is like, hey, folks, fund public schools or prisons, right? So this kind of discourse is baked in. Now we're definitely in a new phase, and history is not, any kind of determination, but there's an evolution for sure of how we've gotten to where we are today.
Thanks so much for that rich context. And you sort of answered this question already, but I was going to ask you a follow-up question around trying to understand, like, what is new about the political conflicts facing schools and what is old. And it sounds like this sort of fear of politics is this sort of old tool that politicians have drawn on when they need to, or when they want to, or when it's convenient. But I'm curious what seems new about the current political conflicts that have taken over school board meetings over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say we see an acceleration, but I would say a lot of these fears have been tried again and again, right? These are persistent tropes: fears of the other, fears of families that are different, kids are different, these manufactured fears. Now, I will say, and this is where Sonia's work is so powerful, the pandemic really did galvanize this other moment. And I'm sure she'll talk much, much more about this with Bob too. But so it's not that everything is the same, but a lot of what we're seeing now, these debates, these going to school board meetings, I mean, we saw the same things in different forms over fears of evolution in the schools. And so, and fears of having LGBTQ teachers in the classroom that have played out over time. And so a lot of this is kind of a replaying of persistent themes that we've seen.
Thank you. Sonia, can you help us understand how we got to the heightened levels of politicization we saw around public education during the pandemic? And also help us think about how these political conflicts are impacting students, teachers, and schools, and the daily hard work of teaching kids in these settings.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. And thanks, Diana, for helping to provide the historical framing on these issues. I can point to elections, I think, as, one of the things that has certainly catalyzed the politicization of public education during the pandemic. I think the mismanagement of the pandemic and, increased racial hostility, violence, discrimination. We've seen a lot of that after the election of Trump. We actually saw it at the election of Obama. And that continued to fuel in ways that led, I would argue, to the election of Trump, and, a different style of governance, of leadership, if you'll call it that, that reflected, I think, a competing set of values in a lot of ways, in terms of not really reflecting, I think, what the spirit of public education is really about. And so I think, again, this theme of fear is a particularly powerful one, in it being used as a tool to make people afraid of their health, the lives of themselves and their family members, especially during the pandemic, what it means for Black or African-American people and other historically underserved populations in this country. So I think it really, while people were in this kind of heightened state of fear and anxiety, in some cases brought out the worst in us. And I think children being at home every day for months, up to a year on end, also, put a stark spotlight on schools and education, and really the incredible role that schools play in a community, which I think we take for granted when things go well. But the pandemic, again, helped to remind us of all the other additional social supports that schools provide in addition to academic learning and content. So a lot has happened since. I'm hoping that we'll learn from it. I'm concerned that maybe we haven't. There were a lot of calls to not return to schooling the way that it was, or not to return to normal, because normal wasn't, okay either. But I'm fearing that we're falling back into a lot of those same patterns, and I'm hoping, including those around racism and fear of the other. And so, my hope is that through conversations like this and a lot of the efforts of educators and organizers and community members and researchers that we can begin to think our ways out of this. And think about our own role as individuals actually in creating the type of schools and community that we want to see. So my hope is that those events will lead us into a direction that is more hopeful in, again, learning from the past, which is a lot of what Diana's work helps us to do, into recognizing one that, you know, while these things can feel very unique and strange, that a lot of these patterns have happened in the past. And I think our challenge today, with access to technology and again, more information that we've ever had, is to create a vision of education that supports the students that we have today and that we'll have tomorrow, to help us become the country that we want to be.
Thank you for that context. I'm curious what you see as some of, well, sort of two maybe follow-up questions, but I'm curious what you see as like what impact these conflicts and the pandemic has had on, what lasting impact has it had on public schools? Like we sort of, you know, we see data around how students are doing, but I'm curious, you know, what other things you're thinking about of like, what are the enduring effects of the pandemic? And what are the lessons that you hope we take away from this if we're putting on that sort of, you know, we're trying to have that hopeful perspective?
Yeah, let's see. I was jumping to hope. What was the first part of the question?
How, I'm curious, like trying to sort of understand how the pandemic, what lasting effects the pandemic has had on public schools.
Right. The thing at the top of my mind was mental health. And I still think we're underestimating the impacts of that. Again, not just depression or anxiety, but fear of the other, and how that changes us in terms of our human interactions. That has been witnessed in classrooms and schools, and even probably driving on, you know, home or to work and back, in terms of social behaviors. And so I think it's a chance for us to almost kind of reset our nervous systems, as well as reset the ways that we think about how we operate in society and connect with one another. And I think schools are just an excellent place for us to be able to do that, to create the spaces where we can model that and be that for our students, so that they have examples of healthy communication and healthy behaviors and healthy relationships. And that requires us to do that for ourselves. You know, so as I'm saying that, I'm already thinking about, you know, the ways that, you know, I would need to continue to grow and develop, right, in order to be that model for young people. So I think there's just a lot of inward work that has to take place. We've done a lot of focusing on the other and what other people need to do and other people who should fix these problems and the other people that are the problem. And I think we're at a time where we need to really look in the mirror, and think about, you know, the role that each of us play and how we can, again, develop ourselves to be in a space where we could be equipped to fight the fight for equity and justice, because it's not easy. It's not for everyone, but for those who, you know, identify as social justice warriors or those who are in the fight, I think now is really the time to invest and pour into ourselves and building our capacity to be able to support others.
Thank you. Bob, I'd love to bring you into this conversation. I know you've written recently about the rise of private school vouchers and the success of the voucher movement over the last few years. In just the last 2 years or 3 years, I think 10 states have passed legislation to enact universal or near universal private school voucher programs. And early analyses indicate that these programs are both incredibly expensive and benefits that are largely accruing to families who were only ever enrolled in private schools. And so, you know, I think these new voucher programs seem like a very different flavor from the voucher programs of, you know, yesterday or pre-pandemic times. And so I'm curious to hear, you know, your perspective on why these universal voucher programs are on the rise, and how will these privatization efforts affect the accessibility and quality of public education in the US?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to join this conversation. I mean, I think it's important to, first of all, like sort of think about, or building on the comments of Diana and Sonia, like like how is public education important in this country, and where do vouchers fit into this? What's happening what are vouchers doing to public education? I think that, taking a step back, we have so many things going on in the country right now affecting public education. We saw, as we just heard, about the pandemic affecting public education and perceptions of public education negatively. We also have the culture war attacks, this anti-CRT cultural, critical race theory movement happening. And we also have low funding of states through school finance wars. And so vouchers are adding on top of that, and they're really accelerating in the last few years. What are vouchers? Just to review, they are mechanisms for public school dollars, or dollars that are meant for public schools, to go instead to private school tuition through either direct payments or scholarships or other mechanisms that basically give parents the ability to use some of that money intended for public schools to private schools and for private school tuition. Historically, they were meant to actually, vouchers started out as a segregation mechanism after Brown versus Board of Education for families to primarily white families to escape the Brown versus Board mandate and to send their kids instead to what were called segregation academies. So there really isn't a good history of vouchers. They're now accelerating suddenly in the last couple of years. As you mentioned, we now have multiple states in which almost every child, if not every child, whether or not they've been to public school ever, they now get money intended for public schools to go then to private schools or even homeschool, or using money for any purpose as long as it ostensibly could relate in some way to the education of the child. So the effects of this are really significant. Fiscally, we know that billions of dollars will leave the public school systems in many states over the next several years. The overall cost of educating kids will go up by, some estimates are as much as a third in terms of educating kids. So it's not saving money, it's adding to the cost of educating children. And as you mentioned, Rachel, the effects on the education quality, the jury is really out. There's the research on this in terms of voucher programs does not show an improvement in education quality, but rather the opposite in many cases. And really, in terms of access and access to schooling, to education, this is where it's really profound. We know that many of the voucher schools are religious in nature. In fact, perhaps the majority of them. And so you immediately get into questions of who is welcome at those schools. Who are religious minorities welcome? Are LGBTQ plus students welcome? Will they serve English learners, students with disabilities? Will they serve low-income students and give them the extra supports and services they need? When you go to a private school system, the accountability mechanisms, those are out the door. Some of the legal protections for students are out the door with private schools. And then a lot of the research and evaluation tools that we traditionally have with public education are also out the door. How are you going to track not only the fiscal impacts of private school voucher programs, but how are you going to track how students are doing, what their outcomes are? It's much harder in a decentralized private school system. And I think these are some of the effects and the effects on democracy that we have to watch for looking forward.
Thank you for that context. I'm curious to pull on a thread from something you mentioned. Can you talk more about the legal protections for students in private schools? Because I think that this is something that's missing from the conversation and that parents aren't always fully aware of. Frankly, I don't think they're fully aware of the legal protections available in public schools. But I'd love to hear you expand on that.
Sure. I mean, in general, when this was not actually that obvious to me before I went to law school and became a lawyer, but in general terms, the Constitution largely applies to public actors or public institutions, at least federally, and many state constitutions, although there's some provisions that do apply to private institutions. Largely speaking, when it comes to non-discrimination, equal protection, First Amendment rights, things of that nature, those protections really only apply to public schools. And so when it comes to admission standards, who's allowed into the program, whether it's on the basis of students of all races, whether it's because of a disability, you might, but for ability reasons, English learners, students from immigrant backgrounds, LGBTQ plus students. Those are categorical protections and identities that are protected in public institutions. But once you move to the private environment, it becomes less clear. It's much more state by state to what extent those state laws might cover and protect students vis-a-vis those private schools. And then when you add the religious component on top of that with religious and parochial schools, then there's even more of a severing from anti-discrimination principles and laws, because of course you have legal protections for religious institutions to not be impinged on by the state, separation of church and state. So it gets even more severed and disconnected from equal protection and discrimination protections when it comes to religious schools. So these are some of the things that are at stake when we're talking about preserving a key cornerstone of democracy like public education. Where are all our students going to be welcome? And how are we going to ensure that that there's an institution in which there's a common thread of education, of learning certain common things in schools, of developing civic education, and appreciation for diverse cultures and communities? How is that going to happen when the public education system shrinks from 90% to 80 to 70 to 60? And that's what's happening now. That's happening in the last few years. It's basically a house on fire situation, and most people aren't aware of it yet. And so that's why, a program like this is super important.
Thank you. Sonia, I'd love to come back to you. Thinking about this conversation, how would you respond to educators and communities who want to fight back against some of these far-right attacks on public education and want to look towards strengthening public schools, towards improving equity in public education? How can they do that? What are some, strategies that educators and communities might look to successfully push back and, fight for public education in this country?
Fear not. I think this theme of fear is one that we really do have to confront in a lot of ways, because when you're talking about children, our grandchildren, as educators, the students, and the families that we engage with, it can have a chilling effect in terms of those who want to limit speech, limit the ability to teach certain topics and histories. But I think we just have to find the courage to stand for what we truly value. It's not easy, but I think there's actually a large and fairly silent, maybe not silent majority, but one that is not as loud as those who are on the extreme ends of these issues, that if we are able to express our values and our concerns and find ways to, mobilize and organize around the type of education that we want to see, I just think it's possible. We have so many levers at our disposal, and it just takes that leadership. It takes someone who's able to galvanize, I think, individuals around a set of values and a purpose of education that aligns with the type of country that we want to be. And I think that second part is the part we're still working through. But, to Bob's point, you need to have that robust, public education system as a cornerstone for our democracy. And I also love that he referenced, that the house is on fire, because I wrote a book many years ago called Learning in a Burning House. And that thing is burnt down to the ground, in my opinion. And COVID helped to I think, really leave us, in a difficult situation. But I think it's time to clear the brush, clear a lot of, I think, the things, again, that we've done wrong. Bob and Diana probably agree that, historically, we know that the system wasn't really designed to serve everybody. And we hear that a lot. So the question now is, well, how do we build one that is for everyone, right? And so I've been arguing that it's time to build a new house, right? With the new tools and resources and ideas and population, quite frankly, that we have in this country. And so it's not to be too cliche, but we can reimagine and create something anew. And I think that's what's exciting. And for anyone who has children or works with young people, right, we don't really have the option to not have hope, in my view. And so if we are hanging on to hope and really wanting to create something special in the future, I think we've just got to put our hearts and hands together. And I know at the Black Education Research Center, we're trying to do our part just through research and educating people about what education can look like, and then figuring out how we can convene the right individuals and organizations to make that happen. So we invite folks to follow the work that we're doing and be a part of that. But I think it's time for a new movement in education that values every child, every community, the democratic spirit, and prepares young people and all people really to be active participants in our democracy.
Thank you. And Bob, I'd love to hear your perspective as an education law expert. Like, what can legislators at different levels of government do? What could a local legislator, a state legislator do if they want to protect public schools and fight back against these attacks?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think legislation has a really important component here, because you can pass laws and policies to protect public education, to strengthen it. Certainly, annually, every legislature around the country has the chance to adequately and equitably fund their public schools. So that's, it's the biggest line item in every state budget every year is education. What are you going to do? Some states are way better than others at ensuring that those per pupil funds are at sufficient levels to provide what kids really need to have a robust, rich education. So we need legislatures to step up to that challenge, number one. But then also there's so many policies that can be passed to start to undo these corrosive laws that are censoring students and books around the country, preventing students from or teachers from talking about certain issues. What if we stepped back from that? How can we not do that? How can the states that do value diversity and multiculturalism and pluralism in schools, how can they affirmatively pass legislation that provides a counterexample to the negative, to the restricting, to the banning? How can we protect our teachers and librarians? How can we protect speech on issues that have to do with these important populations in our country? And so I think that legislatures can play a role there, not to just, be defensive about this, but to go on the offense, to be affirmative, to be affirming. So those are some of the ideas that I have. And certainly where we know that legislatures aren't up for those challenges, my organization, Education Law Center, also plays a role in litigation and lawsuits. And that's important too, because where states and policymakers aren't stepping up, then we have to step in and try to counter those examples, those efforts to privatize schools, to create universal voucher laws. We have to oppose that in the courts. We have to oppose these restrictive anti-speech, anti-equality, they're anti-democratic policies that are trying to strip all of the dimensions of diversity out of education. And we know that that's not true, that's not right, it can't stand.
Thank you. So I know we only have a few more minutes, and I'd love to end on a bit of a more hopeful note. And so I'd love to hear from all of the panelists about something that makes you hopeful for the future of public education in this country. Anna, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think this conversation makes me hopeful. I think conversations like this playing out in lots of different places makes me hopeful. I think that one of the things, and Sonia really brought attention to this, one of the things that happened after the pandemic, during the pandemic, was a real keen awareness of the importance of public schools to our communities, to our families, and what happens when we deprive communities of their public schools, when we close them, when we don't support them. And I think that's a lesson that we would do well to not forget, right? To really hang on to the importance of that. And, public schools are important social safety nets. They're important for communities. But what I would really like us to hold on to is that public education is essential to the strength and health of our democracy, and to the well-being of our nation. And so to really get consensus around that, and as I hear those conversations, I think that's a place to really be hopeful about being able to make some real change and to build that kind of new structure that Sonia's talking to us about.
Just building on that, I mean, I do agree that public education is so essential to a healthy and vibrant democracy. And, I've written before that putting all of our eggs in the basket of public education, that's not going to offer us a complete solution to what's going on in this country and all of the problems that we're facing. But any solution collectively that ignores public education, I don't think is going to be effective. So I think we need to really think about public education and its importance to democracy. What gives me hope is that with some effort, with advocacy, when the communities step up and show that they're concerned, there can be victories, and there are victories. So, we've won a lawsuit in Connecticut recently with the help of National Education Association leading that fight to prevent vouchers from happening in Kentucky. In Illinois, a more limited voucher program was recently repealed after being in existence for several years. In Pennsylvania, the great advocates at Educational Law Center in Pennsylvania and other organizations in Pennsylvania won an important school funding lawsuit that really paved the way for millions of dollars of extra resources to go to high need schools and communities. So with the right efforts, there can be victories, and that really gives me a lot of hope.
I'll just say that I think hopefully I'll live to see systems of schools where there is a love of learning. And I think, again, that we have the people, the passion, the tools, and the technology, even with AI and other things coming along. But, as long as we're creative and we still value human intelligence, I think there's some exciting things on the horizon. And hopefully we'll be able to, put love back into learning, and that education coverage and stories and issues will be something that's a lot more positive and inspiring. And so I'm hoping that we can move in that direction. And I think we will.
Thank you all, Diana, Sonia, Bob, for an incredibly informative conversation. I agree, Diana, this conversation definitely left me hopeful. And thank you to the 92nd Street Y for bringing us all together.
Share America is not about changing anyone's mind, and it's not about finding common ground. The goal is to say, I now see you as a human, even though you see things differently than I do.
Some of the problems that we have in the United States, we don't understand each other.
Community leaders saw this as an opportunity to bring together groups that just don't often connect. Share Our America provides the space for people to share their personal stories and build new relationships and trust.
Our participants were in very personal situations.
As soon as they started to share tables with one another and started to get to know each other, you saw folks start to really open up.
Asking questions all designed to understand rather than to persuade.
I saw people coming out of their shells, and myself as well.
I was riveted by the opportunity from the very beginning.
Over the last 2 years, we've seen participants open up in ways we never could have imagined, whether they gathered for a couple of sessions or just a few hours.
This process of our questioning really gave me a chance to build that trust.
I want to be uncomfortable. That's what keeps life worth living.
We are taking what we've learned across the country so that millions can come together to listen, to share, and really move our world forward. Join us at shareouramerica.org.
Hello, I'm Lisa Desjardins of the PBS NewsHour. The idea of the Electoral College dates all the way back to the founding of the United States, but the term Electoral College is not in the U.S. Constitution. This was something that the founders came up with to deal with the new creation they had, a directly elected head of state and head of government. No other country in the world had attempted that to that point. There was a debate among the founders. Should this be directly elected by the people? Some of the founders said no, that the Americans at that point were either not well educated enough or were not able to get enough communication to really be fully informed on the candidates for president. Others said go the other direction and have Congress electing a president would also be a mistake for a couple of reasons, those including that members of Congress themselves could easily corrupt the process, and that would be the kind of elitism that the founders themselves wanted to avoid. What was the result? The Electoral College, a sort of shadow Congress that now is the final deciding voice in who will be president of the United States, who is not directly elected by the people. This is increasingly an issue that people talk about in terms of our democracy itself. And it is one that is not popular anymore with the American public. Some 65%, according to a Pew Research study, of American adults said they do not want the Electoral College to remain in place as it is today. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of our democracy when it comes to this essential final step in electing our president. And with us to talk about that are two experts, Kostas Panagopoulos, distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Northeastern University, and also Wilfred Codrington. He's professor of law at Brooklyn Law School and author of The People's Constitution. Kostas, I want to start with you first. You have an article in The Independent that I'm going to read the headline of this is, "The Electoral College is bad and outdated. Why do we still use it?" Why do we still use it?
Well, thanks so much, Lisa. It's great to be here and to be talking about this crucially important topic. To be fair, the Independent article cites some of my work. It's not exactly my article or necessarily my point of view, but I think we can agree that there are lots of flaws to the Electoral College. And Americans have felt this way about it, as you pointed out in your introduction, for a very, very long time. Public opinion going back decades suggests that majorities of Americans have supported dismantling the Electoral College. There have been over 500 pieces of legislation in Congress to get rid of the Electoral College. I can remember over 20 years ago now when I was working on Capitol Hill for then Senator Hillary Clinton, we were trying to put a package of reforms together that included getting rid of the Electoral College in favor of a direct election for president. None of those things have really gone very far because it's very difficult, as we all know, to amend the Constitution, and it requires the kind of support nationwide that we wouldn't necessarily get, because as bad as the Electoral College is in some ways, because it can distort the will of the people in interesting ways that we could talk about, there are still some types of places that it advantages, and it advantages smaller states, for example, which would be less willing to accept an alternative or a reform. But I think it's fair to point out that it's not only, as you said in your intro, the term Electoral College that doesn't appear in the Constitution, but there's so much about the Electoral College as we know it today that is not in the Constitution. And that might be part of the problem in this very complicated nature of what the Electoral College is and what it isn't. So, for example, when the Constitution was written, there were not supposed to be political parties in America. I mean, George Washington was very adamant about that, and he advised against that. But this system was not designed for a country in which political parties were active players in politics. And so in one sense, that's a huge change. And the Electoral College, like many other aspects of the Constitution, was a compromise. It was a compromise between what certain states wanted to do and what other states wanted to do. It was very difficult for them to push through direct election of the president, in part because the southern states, which were less populous at the time, would have objected to that. And there were also concerns, as you pointed out, about the capacity of the public and the nature of the limited levels of information it had to make this all important decision about who the president should be. So it was a compromise. But one of the other things that wasn't in the Constitution is the winner-take-all feature of the Electoral College as we know it today that applies to 48 out of the 50 states, which means that if you win the elections, the popular vote in those states, by one vote, or get the most votes, you get all of that state's electoral votes, except in Nebraska and Maine, where they can be divided. So that's a very different system, because this winner-take-all feature creates incentives for political parties and candidates. And the Independent article that you mentioned referenced my forthcoming book on the strategic deployment of resources by presidential campaigns that basically says that campaigns do not have incentives to campaign or target voters in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. They focus on the much, much smaller subset of battleground states that'll make or break their candidacies in the election. And that number of states has been dwindling over time, such that a smaller and smaller number of Americans are actually exposed to any type of presidential campaign in terms of advertisements, visits by candidates, expenditures of resources, et cetera. And that's a direct feature, a direct result of the feature of the Electoral College that allocates electors by winner take all in virtually all states.
Wilfred, I want to talk to both of you about reform efforts, because I know that's something you've written about. We are going to come back to that, but I want to still talk about this, this creature that is the Electoral College a little bit more with you, and specifically that idea that we just heard from Costas, that it is an advantage for some states and not others. That's the way the founders were thinking, was in terms of states and regions. But we know that 5 U.S. presidents, including 2 recent presidents, George W. Bush and Donald Trump, became president because of the Electoral College. They lost the popular vote. So I want to ask you, how do you think about who politically gains from the Electoral College right now and who in the democracy is losing?
Sure. So thank you for that question, and Costas, thank you for laying the ground with all that useful information. Well, the way I think about it is who politically gains and who loses. Well, everybody loses, right? And it's everybody losing because the Electoral College treats us as unequal, right? So based on where you live, and we can think about that in a different ways, but based on where you live, your impact on choosing the singular official who's supposed to be chosen by everyone is more or less, right? And so first, as Costas mentioned, small states have an advantage. And I don't think that that's the biggest advantage, right? But because the Electoral College system is based on the system, the formula for the distribution of members of Congress, including Senate, everybody gets a sort of 2 Senate state bonus or default, plus the 1 representative that you would get. So no place has less than 3 electoral votes, irrespective of their population. And then you add more with your population. But because of the sort of disparity in size of states, California is nearly 40 million people and Wyoming is about 650,000, about the size of Boston. Wyoming gets a bit of a boost. So small states definitely get a boost. The other states that kind of get an advantage, as Costas also sort of suggested, are these swing states, these dwindling swing states. Now, they've changed from time to time in terms of which states are the swing states, right? Some states used to be more determinative and they kind of changed with their demographics and things like that. But because certain states have that sort of closer balance, and they also have a certain number of electoral votes that might be more advantageous for candidates to kind of go there, campaign there, and try to get their voters out. They have an advantage there. Now, it's not a sort of numerical advantage sort of in the way that small states are, but it is because they are going to determine the outcome, right? They have enough electoral votes, and they're in a strategic enough place for them to make that decision. So those are the 2 big ones in terms of sort of state advantages. Now, I want to go back to history for a second,
okay. Yeah,
because there is a historical advantage too, and we would be remiss not to talk about that. One of the historical advantages went to the South, and this was based on how the Electoral College came about. Again, I gave the formula, it being based off the same way that we determine our congressional delegations. Well, we all know that 95% of Black people during that time were enslaved, and they were in the South. And so you had this figure, a large number of non-voting people who the Constitution really didn't even consider people but property. They were boosting the electoral clout of these states without adding to any of the political decision making. And so I'm referring to what we call the 3/5 compromise, right? And so a place like Virginia, which had after the first census about 450 white people, had the same number of sort of white free people as a place like Pennsylvania. However, Virginia also had 300,000 slaves, right? And so 60% of those slaves would count towards Virginia's population in terms of its representation in Congress and in the Electoral College. And so the way that this works out was Virginia ended up with more electoral votes than Pennsylvania because they had slavery in that way. And in that way, it was a perverse incentive to continue and to grow slavery because it would give you more political clout in the political decision making. And so it's therefore not surprising that of our first 5 presidents, 4 of them were slave owners from Virginia. Right? Just let that sit in for a second, right? We were inducing people to continue the institution of slavery because they would be rewarded by more seats in Congress and more chance of affecting the outcome in the Electoral College.
Even though none of those slaves could vote, right? So at least initially, they were counted toward representation, or 3/5 of them were, but none of them could actually cast ballots.
It is remarkable and just undermining the very concept of democracy from the beginning. We know it's an imperfect democracy, but in this way, so brutally so. Another aspect of this, and then I want to talk about the reform aspects that I want to ask both of you about, though. You're mentioning who is advantaged, disadvantaged, and you talked about small states, both of you, and I know you mean populous in terms of the population, but that's usually rural states, and I'm not trying to force a conclusion here, but isn't that those are usually, in modern times have been Republican states? Is there some thought here that one party has way more in the game to keep the Electoral College going than the other? I don't know if that'll change in 50 years, but is that part of the issue now, why the Electoral College has stuck around? Or the Republicans have had 2 presidents because of this?
Well, I think that's right. There does seem to be in recent elections, given the distribution of partisan affiliations in states across the country, and a Republican advantage to the Electoral College. And because the Democratic Party actually has, according to opinion surveys, an advantage in party registration for quite some time, Republicans have been reluctant to abandon the Electoral College, which does seem to give them a bit of a leg up. In part because of this advantage.
Wilfred.
Yeah, so I'll pick up there too. And one, I want to go back to the history because I don't want to say that sort of disempowerment of minorities stopped with slavery. It did not, right? And so, we had this long period of Jim Crow where Black people, even though we had the 15th Amendment, were supposed to be able to vote, they were not, right? Where you had abysmal levels of registration and voting, particularly again in the South. And so now those places where they used to get 3/5 of the Black people counting towards their representation, they got 5/5. And those Black people were not voting at that time, right? And so it was perpetuating that same, those same it was an ill conceived idea, right? Because it would basically say, you can have more power as white supremacists in this way, just by depressing the vote or not allowing people to vote. And, that shows even in terms of the reform efforts, because there was a near successful abolition of the Electoral College in 1969, 1970. Where you got the supermajority support in the House of Representatives to pass a constitutional amendment resolution. But when it went to the Senate, they filibustered it. And when the filibuster was anchored by Southern segregationists, and they knew that it would be in their interest to keep the Electoral College in that way because, they were able to basically waste minority votes in the South, which is again where most Black people were. But now, that number, we're not a Black and white country anymore. And so we look very different. But in any way you slice this, the Electoral College is treating us as unequal and only based on sort of happenstance of where we actually happen to live.
That is so interesting. I'm trying to restrain myself from getting into John C. Calhoun and nullification and the through line of the filibuster in the U.S. Senate and how much that has done in terms of American policy and especially regarding race. Well, maybe another conversation for another convention, but I do want to ask you, let me come back to you then, Wilfred. You have an article in the Columbia Law Review, I know, about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Tell us what that is a little bit, and then where are we with it? Do you think there is a real chance that this could be a way to not dissolve the Electoral College, but to try and get to popular vote anyway?
Sure. Yeah. So part of the National Popular Vote Compact, I mean, really, it draws on the system, the flawed system of the Electoral College itself. So the Electoral College and the provisions in the Constitution have it such that, we don't even necessarily choose our electors, right? We only get to vote for the electors because the states say we can. But really, if we look in the Constitution, it's the state legislators that have ultimate determination who those electors are. So, at this point, all 50 states have said that the popular vote winner in their state will get all their electors, or, the two that do not give them all, Nebraska and Maine, they will split them. But so we all do have some say, but the states can take that power back. The state legislators can choose, and the Supreme Court said so in Bush v. Gore. What the National Popular Vote Compact does is it says, well, we're going to have a bunch of states agree. They're going to pass legislation to join this compact, such that the state legislators will choose the electors based on who wins the national popular vote nationally, right? Irrespective of who wins the popular vote in their state. And so by that thinking, if you get enough states to sign on, enough states that account for 270 electoral votes, which is what you need to win the presidency, you get a de facto presidential election by the popular vote. And so that's the sort of idea. You keep this Electoral College, which is flawed, as we've been speaking about, but you try to work in that. You have this kind of constitutional workaround. So you actually get a de facto popular vote. And so right now, where it is about 2/3 of the way there. And that sounds great. And people should be hopeful about that. And people should look more into it and sort of press their lawmakers, their state legislators to really consider these things. But the states that have signed on have all been Democratic states. I think there's one purple state. I think, if we consider Virginia as purple. So by the same token, as Costa said, and as you raised earlier, that Republicans see it not in their interest to get rid of the Electoral College, Republican lawmakers in the states are also seeing it not in their advantage to join the National Popular Vote Compact.
Costas, do you see a path for reform or changing the electoral system right now?
Well, one of the difficulties to adopting reform is that there's not necessarily a consensus on an alternative that's better than the Electoral College, because all of the alternatives are flawed in one way or another. They just create different sets of imbalances, right? So in terms of the National Popular Vote Plan, 16 states in the District of Columbia have already passed it. That accounts for over 200 electoral votes. A few more states passing it could get us to 270. It would be a voluntary agreement, and I think it would be challenged on constitutional grounds, but it could conceivably hold up, and it would be this workaround, as you just heard a moment ago, so you wouldn't have to amend the Constitution. But if we actually took seriously the notion of amending the Constitution, the alternative might be a direct election for president, right? A popular vote, straight out popular vote. Of course, that would create advantages for highly populous places, for urban areas, and it would just change the incentive so that instead of campaigning in battleground states, where the election was competitive. Presidential candidates would campaign mainly in high population areas and try to win those areas and virtually disregard places like Wyoming and other places where the populations are so small and dispersed that it doesn't really make sense for them to compete because they could amass votes more quickly in higher population areas. So you could argue that it would make money and it would make media and television advertising even more important than it is today. But I think it's also important to go back to the founding conversations about the Electoral College. You know, the way we allocate electors right now is depending on which campaign wins the popular vote in those states, that campaign's electors are slated and can cast ballots. But that's not the way it was supposed to be. The Electoral College was supposed to be comprised of groups of individuals selected by their state legislatures because they were, in theory, independently minded arbiters, wise individuals who could not fall for the passions of the day and who could make wise choices on important decisions like who should be president. And they weren't bound to one party or another or one candidate or another, but they could make these independent judgments that reflected some higher sense of rationality or deliberative contemplation. That's basically not what we have right now, right? If you win the popular vote, you get that state's electors, and those are the people who get slated. So you don't have to have any independent or thinking at all. You just show up and cast your ballots and submit your ballot for the candidate that you were slated to represent in the Electoral College. So that just changes things very dramatically, and it changes one of the central features of the Electoral College, which was supposed to put this all-important decisions of who should be president in the hands of people who could make that judgment without these other considerations or base concerns like partisan attachments.
Can I just add something there? I want to just push back a little bit on one thing Casa said, which is how a direct popular vote would work. I think that's a harder question to actually say more concretely. And I think there's 2 points that he mentioned that I just want to think about a little bit more. One is whether rural or urban areas would benefit by this. And I don't know that that's clear. One is because we're neither an urban nor a rural country, but more suburban, right? And so if we think about the demographic breakdown of where Americans are, we have about 20-25% in the rural areas and 20-30% in the urban areas, and everybody else is in the suburban, exurban area, right? And that's not just like one state owns all the suburbs and exurbs. Every state has suburbs and exurbs, right? And we know that that's where candidates tend to compete irrespective of where they're going, right? So if they go to Ohio, because Ohio is a battleground state, I wouldn't say Ohio is anymore, but let's just say it is, right? They're not always going to the urban areas or to the rural areas. They're most often going to these suburban areas because that's where your median voters are. That's who's going to decide. So because that's distributed all over the country, I think you still would see candidates out in these places. I also want to just push back a little bit about the high populous states versus not. I mean, and there, I think there's probably a little bit more truth that we'd be more likely to go to California and Texas and New York and Florida. But one, let's think about that distribution of states, right? There's 2 blue and 2 red in there, right? And so if we think about how this lays on to party, it's not like any particular party is being advantaged by that. But within that, there's still a lot of Republicans and Democrats in either state that are being ignored presently. So in Texas, there are millions of Democrats who are never going to be, and their votes are not going to ever be courted because we know that there are about 1 million more Republicans, right? And that's going to win the balance in a winner-take-all system. Likewise, in California, there are millions of Republicans. And in fact, the most Republican votes probably come out of California, even though California is going to go for Democrats, and we know that. And so I do think it's going to change campaigning. I just don't know how that would be because it is somewhat speculative, and particularly in this era where social media changes the whole nature of campaigning in general, right? I go onto Instagram and I see campaigns no matter where I am. And I think that is a big part of how campaigning has changed in a way that the founders and even some people have not really conceptualize it today.
Well, I think,
Hey, so-
Wilfred,
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Costas.
you're absolutely right in the sense that a direct national popular vote presidential election would make every vote count. Right? Every voter would count no matter where they live, whether it's in small states or big states or rural states or urban or suburban areas. So in that sense, you couldn't just wholesale, disregard any vote like campaigns can do right now. They can basically write off voters in Texas because they're going to vote one way or another in the overall, or California or Massachusetts, and focus on the battleground states. But you could say, well, why don't we just abandon the winner-take-all feature of the Electoral College, and you could essentially achieve the same goal, because states would be able to split up their electoral votes depending on the distribution of votes within those states on election day. And if Republicans got 40% of the vote in California, they would get 40% of the electors in California. The complication there is that you would have a much tougher time getting to 270 electoral votes. And especially if there were more than two candidates for president, they could peel off enough votes so that if no one got to 270, the election would end up in the House of Representatives, where the process is even less democratic than the Electoral College, because every state would get only one vote. So California and Wyoming would each get one vote for president in the House of Representatives. No matter how large or small your population is, you get one single vote, and there's not even any guidance about how that vote is to be decided upon in Congress. So it's happened before, and it's messy. And one of the reasons why the winner-take-all feature exists in the Electoral College is to amass enough electoral votes quickly enough so that someone gets to 270 and settles the election before it ends up in the House of Representatives, where the process is, as I said, even more chaotic and less democratic.
And let's complicate that one more time.
I'm going to interrupt that. We do have time for just one more, I think, quick question. But go ahead, finish your thought, Wilfred.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're talking about 270 being the number to win, but that number can also change. We have not changed the size of the House of Representatives, even though members of Congress are representing larger and larger districts than they've ever represented. But that's a statutory number. So we could increase the size of the House of Representatives, and that would change the size of the Electoral College, which would at least make it somewhat a little bit more fair and a little bit more representative.
And easier to handle mathematically, I suppose, would be one thing. One thought that I have from all that you're saying is, should we go to this more direct, some form of direct election, it would also change, I think, how journalists cover elections. To think of the idea that a Texas Democrat would be just as important as a New York Democrat, it would change, who we try to talk to, what we're talking to them about in an interesting way, I think. All right, but unfortunately, we are wrapping up. One more quick question, just a minute each, and you'll probably be happy that I'm not giving you more time, because it's a predictor question, the kind that I hate, but
Just don't ask who's going to win.
Let's see. No, I won't do that. But okay, in about a minute each of you, I wonder, this idea that we have had 2 of the 5 presidents elected without the popular vote in modern times, in this century, depending on how you count 2000, do you think that trend is likely to continue, or do you think that is kind of just a happenstance with those 2 elections? Are we likely to see more presidents elected because of the Electoral College without the popular majority? Wilfred?
I think it's more likely than not that this is a trend that could continue to grow. Because if we think about when it happened last time as well, the last 2 times are also clumped together during a period also of intense political polarization. So there are a lot of factors that would complicate how this is going to work. Do we depolarize as a country? Is there a more even distribution of how people are sort of living? People talk like a lot. There's an exodus from the north to the south. So some of these things are all dependent on those sorts of circumstances. But we are still a fairly evenly divided country. I think the candidates we look at now are not necessarily reflective of the parties or their sort of basis as much as other ones. But so I think when the candidates are a little bit more aligned with their bases, I think it spells more trouble.
Costas.
Unfortunately for Republicans, it's really one of the few ways they can win national elections. Because if you look at the distribution of partisan preferences across the country, Democrats have an advantage. They've had an advantage for decades, and they continue to have an advantage. And even if you think about independent voters, there is seemingly a larger number of independent voters, but most of independent voters can generally align with one of the major parties or another. When push comes to shove, they're called, what we call leaning partisans. They usually lean toward one party or another. And so there are not as many independents in this country, true independents who could go either way in elections, right? Generally speaking, they can fall on the side of one party or another, and Democrats would continue to have an advantage. So if it's a matter of Democratic votes versus Republican votes, there are just so many more of them nationally across the country. Now, that doesn't mean Republicans will never win any presidential election. You could get popular candidates on the Republican side who attract independent and Democratic voters, for example, but it's just much more difficult to do when you're starting off at a disadvantage like that in terms of how people view themselves and which party they affiliate with most, or feel most attached to. And there, as I said, Democrats continue to have an advantage in opinion surveys.
Guys, this was a fantastic conversation, and maybe overthinking here. First of all, I want to tell everyone in the state of Wyoming, we appreciate you, regardless of your relative size or influence on our elections. And to all the Texas Democrats, of course, you are important. Not to say that you're not important, but obviously some Electoral College means that different people have different power in our presidential race. So thank you to both of you, Kostas Panagopoulos and Wilfred Codrington.
Welcome to this panel on the threat of misinformation in the upcoming election. This year, 2 billion people are expected to vote in dozens of countries, including our own. And misinformation, which is to say false information, is one of the major threats to the future of global democracy and to the future of American democracy. In 2024, we face new challenges such as AI, alongside deep political distrust and rumors that go viral at record speeds on social media. And so on this panel, we're going to be discussing how to identify and prevent misinformation about the election in this climate and amidst these growing challenges. I am Dr. Maya Kornberg. I am a political scientist and fellow at the NYU Brennan Center for Justice, where I lead work related to Congress, misinformation, and civic engagement. And I've worked on these issues in academic settings as well as nonprofits and international organizations. And I recently wrote a book last year on how Congress works and how we can fix it. And during the 2022 midterms, my research explored the spread of election misinformation on social media. I'm joined here today by two leading experts in the field. Dr. Oren Etzioni is the founder of TrueMedia.org, a nonprofit fighting political deepfakes. He was the founding chief executive officer at the Allen Institute for AI, where he served as CEO. He is professor emeritus at the University of Washington, where he helped pioneer meta search, online comparison shopping, machine reading, and open information extraction. And he is also technical director of the AI2 Incubator and a venture partner at Madrona. He has also founded several companies, including Faircast, which was acquired by Microsoft. Joining us will also be Professor Letitia Bode. She is a professor in the Communication, Culture, and Technology Master's Program at Georgetown University and the research director for the Knight Georgetown Institute. She researches the intersection of communication, technology, attitudes, and behavior, emphasizing the role communication and information technologies may play in the acquisition, use, effects, and implications of both information and misinformation. So I want to start this conversation with the two of you actually by looking back. Misinformation is not a new problem. It is certainly not new in the election space. And so I wonder what we can learn from previous elections that can help inform and prepare us for this upcoming election year. Our own Brennan Center research about the social media conversation in 2022 showed that prominent election deniers were relying on a core of false narratives that they kind of reused and recycled things about voting machines and mail voting and voter fraud. These core false narratives recurred, repeated, and evolved. And so as we look ahead into the 2024 election, are there core false narratives from previous elections that you foresee being recycled? And more broadly, what do you think are the most dangerous false narratives that we may see in the upcoming election? And maybe we'll start with you, Professor Bode.
Thanks so much, Maya. I think this is such a fantastic question, and one we should be asking ourselves more often. What can we learn from the past, and especially recent past elections? I think that we've actually learned a lot about dealing with misinformation in the modern media environment over the past couple of US elections specifically. And I think you made a great point that this is a global election year. Some people are calling it the World Cup of elections, right? Everybody gets to vote this year. So it's a really exciting time, but also a really dangerous time for harmful misinformation to take hold. And I think that in the US context, my sense is that the 2022 election, the media learned a lot about what can work and what can't work in terms of reducing belief in these kinds of core narratives that you're talking about. And I totally agree that all electoral misinformation is predictable. Not all. 90% of electoral misinformation is predictable, and it follows the same kinds of tropes. And so there's a lot that you can do to kind of pre-bunk or inoculate people ahead of time about what they can expect in terms of how the process works, what it looks like, when we should expect returns and why, when we should expect changes in, leads and why, based on the kinds of ballots that are coming in at different times in the process. And doing some of that kind of laying the groundwork for what people should expect, I think can make a really big difference in those kind of core narratives taking hold or not taking hold. The second part of your question, which narratives are most harmful? To me, it's all of the ones that undermine democracy. So the specific types of misinformation that are about the process, the electoral process, about democracy not working, about it not being trustworthy, those to me are the most harmful because they are going to have trickle-down effects on whether or not people are willing to engage in the process that our entire country is founded on. So that's really harmful.
Thank you. Dr. Etzioni.
So I would like to highlight, again, obviously there's a lot to say about the past, but I'd like to highlight just how narrowly contested our elections have been. There's the Trump-Biden one, but even back to Bush-Gore and the Dimple-Chads. The reason that's so important in this context is that a small number of votes in the right state or in the wrong state can sway the election. And that's why the danger of misinformation and deep fakes in particular is so terrifying, right? You and I, right, the three of us, I don't think we're going to be swayed. We're already inoculated. And the same is true for extremists on either side. But it's that swing vote that really matters. And I want to add, I know we're about to go to this, but we need to learn from the past. And at the same time, we need to think about how this election is going to be different. And my concern as a technologist and longtime AI researcher is that AI technology and specifically deep fakes are going to use to create more compelling, more viral disinformation than ever before.
Thank you. So I actually wanted to follow up on that point about deep fakes. I know this is a particular area of expertise for you, Dr. Etzioni. And I was struck by a recent poll that I read. This was over the summer. A survey firm called YouGov asked Americans about concerns related to AI, and a staggering 85% listed audio and visual deepfakes as a major concern. And deepfakes, for those in the audience who are not familiar with the term, are just videos and images or audio files that are modified using machine learning. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what you started to get at, which is how deepfakes can exacerbate the danger of election misinformation and how we can combat this threat that deepfakes pose.
Absolutely. So 2 quick background comments. The first one is, in general, I'm an AI optimist. I think AI can do a lot of good, but here we're dealing with a very negative scenario. The second background comment is, of course, deepfakes
Thank you for that informative explanation, and I'm particularly heartened by your explanation of the steps that can be taken to address it. And so, Professor Butt, I want to turn to you again, and if you could kind of drill down a little bit more into kind of some of the other strategies. So we've used the word inoculation in this conversation a few times, and you mentioned pre-bunking. In some of your previous research, you've looked at user correction. So that is kind of sharing accurate information in response to misinformation. So if you could share a little bit more about what you think the most effective strategies are to prevent misinformation from spreading once you spot it, or actually to prevent it preemptively in some instances with some strategies.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big question. So Carnegie actually just put out a whole report on this, looking at kind of 10 different buckets of interventions against misinformation, and which of them we have good evidence for and which of them we have less evidence for. So if people are interested in reading more about this particular question, I would highly recommend that report. Having said that, yeah, my research focuses a lot on stopping the spread in particular, in kind of a couple of different ways. So obviously we don't want anyone to believe misinformation, but if one random person believes something that they see online and doesn't, fact check it the way we want them to and doesn't verify, that's probably not the end of the world. Whereas if they share it with a bunch of people who then share it with a bunch of people, etc., that becomes more of a problem. So anything we can do to kind of limit that sharing, that kind of second step, and especially the kind of networked effects that happen, especially on social media, is really advantageous to limiting the harm that's done by misinformation, which, as you started this panel by saying, is never going to go away. There's always going to be misinformation. It's always existed and it always will. So it's really about mitigating the harm that's done by it. And My research suggests that user correction, so people correcting misinformation when they see it, when they feel confident in doing so, when they have the resources to do so, when they have the time to do so, which is obviously not all the time, makes a big difference in terms of on social media, you have this whole audience of people that get to see you correct someone else. So it's just a matter of kind of making sure that the misinformation that you saw doesn't go uncontested when the next person sees it. It has that kind of red flag on it of somebody else saying, I have a different perspective, not even I have a different perspective, but check out these facts, right? That go against this misinformation. So that just kind of reduces that network spread in a way that can be really impactful.
If I can just chime in really quickly, because I love what you said. One of the key use cases for truemedia.org is exactly that, right? You see something that's potentially suspicious, you upload it, you get our report, which is concise and visual, that tells you that this is highly suspicious or there's potential evidence of this kind of faking strategy, and you can share it just as you said. So we're very much seeing what we're doing as a component in support of the strategy that you described.
Thank you. And I had a follow-up question actually about these strategies. So we, of course, know that we live in a very large and very diverse country, and it has many linguistics and cultural communities. And in our own analysis in 2022, we compared Spanish versus English language social media posts, and we saw that in many instances, the topics of the conversation, perhaps not surprisingly, about the election were slightly different when you compared English language and Spanish language media. This is just one example of something that we all know, which is that different communities get information through different channels. They speak about things in different ways, and therefore they have different vulnerabilities when it comes to misinformation. And so in the context of some of the solutions that you shared, and perhaps others as well, how do we ensure that our solutions are tailored and culturally competent as well as effective in dealing with a problem that crosses many languages and generations and in many instances, cultures as well? Perhaps I see Letitia Bode, you unmuted yourself. So please, Professor Bode.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question, and it's one that we're still figuring out to some extent, but in some ways it's no different than any other type of communication, which of course has to be targeted in meaningful ways. And the most effective communication happens at an interpersonal level. So that's always going to be more effective communication than kind of a mass broadcasting. I'm more influenced by talking to a friend or a neighbor than I am by looking at a billboard on the highway. And the same is going to be true for misinformation, which allows more of that personalization because you do have that existing relationship and you have cultural competence, community competence in that way that you don't necessarily have in other contexts. So I think that's part of the power of user correction is that you have that kind of existing, at least potentially, you can also correct a stranger online, but at least potentially you have that kind of existing relationship that you can build on and use that existing trust to build goodwill in engaging in that kind of correction.
I would just add that our technology is language independent. So truemedia.org, we ran, for example, on deep fakes from the Indonesian election, and they were quite rampant and actually quite influential, and we were able to detect them just fine. So it's not personalized, but it is language independent.
Thank you. And the next question is about the political climate right now in which we're working on this issue. So over the past year, Ohio Representative Jim Jordan's Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government has targeted many people, including researchers, election officials, civil servants, with subpoenas and information requests. Do you think that this has had a chilling effect on research and advocacy about misinformation and specifically election misinformation? And then more broadly, I'm wondering if you could share what you think the biggest challenges are of working on this issue in the current political climate.
Well, I'll say something quick. It's rather ironic, right, that he's weaponizing the federal government and its subpoena powers in the context of discussing weaponizing the federal government. Of course, it's the legislative branch, and he's talking about the executive branch. Nevertheless, it's highly ironic what he's doing. It's definitely had a chilling effect because I've spoken to several people who were targets of these subpoenas, and I've been warned. If you build truemedia.org, you're going to become a target. My response to that is actually not combative, but to point out that our goal is not to censor anybody, right, which is a concern certainly on the right and the extreme right, but our goal is to provide a technical assessment. Just, was this video manipulated? Is this audio automatically synthesized? And that information can be shared and can be part of the conversation, can be part of the assessment in social media, as Professor Bode alluded to. So I'm hoping that if even the extreme right takes a dispassionate look, they'll say that what True Media is doing is beneficial to the democratic process, not an attempt to silence or manipulate anyone, but an attempt to contribute what's ultimately is metadata, right? It's information about this video or about this audio.
Thank you, Professor Bode.
I think it's hard to deny that it's had a chilling effect to some extent, partly just out of, goodwill to one another. It's a hard time to convince a grad student that they should be working in misinformation right now, for example, right? Like, that's a hard sell at this point. Having said that, I don't think that misinformation research is going anywhere. I don't think that people are giving up on work that they think is important because of the current political climate. And I think that, kind of building on what Oren said, I think that at the core of it, we all care about the same things. Nobody is advocating for censorship. We all care about free speech. A lot of the work that I do, for instance, on correction is essentially counter speech, right? It's more speech. It's lots of speech. So I think everybody is kind of on the same page when you take it to a high enough level. It's just about kind of working out the details of how we navigate this new information environment together, and that's going to be something we figure out together as a society.
Thank you. And a follow up on that, on kind of the conversations that are being had about speech. So we're having this conversation in the context of a very important Supreme Court case about net choice that is going on right now. We also know, again, from many different research projects, that social media can act as a major vector for the spread of misinformation. And there, can be certain spreaders of misinformation that fuel viral rumors, as I mentioned at the outset, that grow and spread online very quickly. So in this context, how do you think that social media companies, policymakers regulating tech, and kind of others in this space can specifically be stemming the spread of election misinformation on social media, which, as we know, is one of the major platforms, especially as the conversation about the election increasingly moves online? And perhaps we'll start with you, Dr. Etzioni.
I have a simple, pragmatic solution. I'm not a policy expert or even social network expert, but it seems to me that if we're willing to, in the, let's say, 30 days before a major election, adopt special rules, and this is based, right, in Minnesota, there's a law in the books that talks about 90 days before the election. In Slovakia, there's a media blackout and candidate blackout 48 hours before the election. So the exact period of time is open to discussion. I think the exact rules are open to discussion. But if we can accept that in the run-up to an election, given the power of technology, given the power of social networks, if we can adopt some kind of what Daryl West from the Brookings Institute called circuit breakers, if we can put some safeguards in place that prevent people from yelling fire falsely in a crowded theater, democracy will be better off.
Thank you, Professor Bode.
I think my answer comes down to making sure all of those people have the information they need to be able to make the best decisions that they can in those capacities. So the Knight Georgetown Institute that I work with is focused exactly on that, of getting evidence-based research to decision makers in the space of technology and information. So people that work at technology firms that are making decisions about how they design their platforms or what ads they run or anything like that. Policymakers that are deciding what regulation is appropriate or how they're going to make decisions in this capacity. We want all of them to have good evidence that is based in research, that is nonpartisan, that is reliable, and have it in an accessible way. So that's what we're focused on. And I think that hopefully we believe that those people have the country's best interests at heart and will make decisions based on that evidence if they have better access to it.
Thank you. And as we near the end of our session, I want to end with two kind of bigger picture questions. We focused a lot on what you both work on and what many of the advocates and researchers and legislators in the field can and should be doing. But for the members of our audience, what can everyday average Americans do right now and over the next few months to be identifying and preventing the spread of misinformation? And yeah, we'll start with you, Dr. Etzioni.
Sure. If you see something, say something, right? It's so tempting when there's a swirl of all this stuff just to tune it out. You know, I've deleted Facebook, right? I don't use Facebook anymore, but that's not good enough in this situation. So people need to step up. We're, for example, asking people, if you come across a deep fake, send it to us. Just email it to us. So we, because there's no search engine that covers all of social media. And of course, it can be in a semi-private forum on Facebook or WhatsApp, et cetera. So if you see something, say something. As Professor Bode said, if you find out that it's suspicious or you have questions, respond. I think that the only chance that we have is to have a grassroots of communal participation to fight this. And if you think that I'm being somewhat idealistic and naive, let me just mention one example where this already happened. So when this inappropriate and illegal content about Taylor Swift emerged, the Swifties, as they're called, all jumped in and posted appropriate images of her to drown out the fakes before they were taken down and then they were put back on. And it became this kind of online battle, if you will, between people who are trying to protect her and people who are trying to attack her. And when I tuned in, which was, I don't know, 12 hours later, the Swifties won. It was wonderful. I was looking around and the content was no longer accessible. It was drowned out by positive images and positive hashtags. And I just thought that was fantastic because it shows that if we work together, we can make a big difference and make it quickly.
Thank you, Professor Bode.
I wholeheartedly agree that this is really about changing norms of what is appropriate. And the more people are willing to do this, the more normal it becomes, the less offended people are, and the more willing you are to do it the next time because nobody's going to attack you for it. So it's really about just deciding as a culture that this is something we care about. We care about accurate content even more than we care about other things like our personal identities or our emotions. And I think that's the other thing I would say is just anytime you feel a strong emotion when you're scrolling through content online, you should instantly be skeptical of whatever that content is. Someone is trying to manipulate your emotions. That's a really bad sign. So just take that particular piece of content, whatever it is, with an extra grain of salt and take an extra deep breath before you even think about sharing it or anything along those lines.
Thank you. And I'll end with the last question that zooms out even further to where we began, which is that we're facing an American election this year, but we're in a year where 2 billion people are going to vote in many elections around the world. And as we progress into this year, how can we best be learning from other countries and working together kind of globally to fight what will be an international problem of election misinformation?
Sure, we'll continue with the rhythm. So we've already learned, this is already happening, right? We've had elections in Indonesia and Taiwan and other places, and we see these as practice runs. We see what people are doing, and that's what's galvanized us at True Media to focus on deepfakes. So I think that our tools are coming out in March, so we'll be ready before the EU elections in June, and certainly before ours. But I think that, as you mentioned, we want to learn from the past, not just the distant past, but every election that we face is a learning opportunity as to what works and what adversarial actors are doing. I do have to end. I'm a very positive person, as maybe you can tell, but I have to end with a note of caution. I'm terrified because every week, every month, the technology, and of course, many of us saw OpenAI's Sora demonstration, right? The technology is getting better. The believability of fakes is getting stronger, and we are going to experience a tsunami of disinformation in our November election.
Thank you, Professor Bode. Answer to this and any final parting words.
Yeah, so I will second the opportunity to really learn from other elections, not just in terms of what narratives are taking hold and what's being done about deepfakes and any of those kinds of things, but also about what are the policies that seem to be making this better or worse? What are the, platform usage structures that seem to be making this better or worse? This is really an educational opportunity, given that there's so many elections this year. And then I am also an optimist, so I will slightly counter what Dr. Etzioni said, which is that I was terrified, and I think that the timing is actually not as bad as it could be because people are actually learning already right now about deepfakes and what they can do. The Taylor Swift thing, honestly, is the best education that we could have for what deepfakes are. Everybody knows about it. And now they know to be more skeptical of videos that they see, that not every video is going to be legitimate, even though in a previous life, that was true. Videos were legitimate. Now it's something that you have to be more skeptical of, and people are really adaptable. And I think that hopefully we will adapt in time for this not to be too detrimental and too harmful on the electoral process.
Well, that seems like a perfect note to end on, and I particularly appreciate the nuance of both the terror and the reason for fear, as well as the optimism and the many things that we can do to prepare ourselves, which we discussed throughout this conversation. So thank you again so much for your time and your insights and your expertise. I'll just remind the audience of one of, I think, the most important things that was shared here, which is, as Dr. Etzioni said, if you see something, say something. And it's so important, I think, to just be educating ourselves and to be acting in this space in order to protect our democracy.
Hi, I'm Susan Page, the Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and I'm glad to moderate this panel for the 92nd Street Y about the future of the Republican Party at this important moment. This live stream is going to be posted on March 5th, which is, of course, Super Tuesday, and maybe a good moment to look at where the party is today and where it might be headed tomorrow. And joining me for this conversation is Jonah Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Dispatch and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Asted Herndon, national politics reporter for the New York Times and host of the political podcast, The Run-Up, and Tara Setmeyer, political commentator, former Republican communications director on Capitol Hill, and a resident scholar at UVA's Center for Politics. Thank you all for being here. So let's start with just a round the horn question. Here's the question. Will Donald Trump be the Republican nominee in 2024? Jonah, you go first.
Barring some crazy health thing, yes.
Tara?
Absolutely. No question.
What about you, Asted?
100%. Absolutely.
So that sounds like a pretty united party. I mean, that's the fastest close to a contested nomination battle in modern American times. He didn't do debates. He did only the occasional campaign rally. And yet he's now, in your minds, basically clinched the nomination. Is that a united party, Tara?
Well, I'd say yes and no. It's united in that obviously the party has now become the party of Donald Trump, given all of the leadership of the party. The Republican National Committee is now going to be taken over by Trump folks. By now, it may already have been. We're hearing rumors that Mitch McConnell will eventually endorse Donald Trump. So in that respect, the coalescing behind supporting Donald Trump at this point, I would say, yeah, it's a unified party. However, there is a strong enough contingent within the party that gave Nikki Haley some fuel. She won almost 40% of the vote in South Carolina. There were considerable amounts of Republicans who said they didn't want to vote for Donald Trump in Iowa. And there is a fracture within the party, I think, about exactly where they want to go, except that the rules in the primary have been changed in a lot of states to be winner take all and stacked it in favor of Donald Trump early on, which is what hasn't allowed for any real opposition to him that I think many in the party were quietly hoping for. But it has not been permitted to do because they didn't really strongly come out enough publicly for fear of retribution from the MAGA base. So I'd say it's unified sort of, but there are fractures in the foundation of the party that could be problematic for them in the general election.
Hey, Jonah, Mitch McConnell endorsing Donald Trump. The two men haven't spoken in almost 4 years. What does it mean if that happens, if and when that happens?
It means I'm going to start day drinking again.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll answer that, but I also, just to pick up on the last, I agree with everything Tara said, but at the same time, I think it's a little more pronounced. Patrick Buchanan in 1992 performed worse than Nikki Haley has been performing so far. And those of us who are old enough to remember that, his challenge of George H.W. Bush was seen as a sign of major disunity in the party. Similarly, Ted Kennedy and Jerry Brown, when they challenged Jimmy Carter, they basically got the same shares that Trump has not been getting, right? And the reason I bring that up is while Trump is not technically an incumbent, I think pretty much every pundit out there, to one degree or another, has said he's been operating as a quasi-incumbent, a de facto incumbent, in part because he's got 100% name ID, he's the former president, he's secured control of big chunks of the party, he never let go of the infrastructure of the party, and a large number of Republicans believe the lie that the last election was stolen. So the normal organic process of learning from the last defeat and letting another faction have their turn was short-circuited. And so I do think that there's a much deeper divide in the party, in part because issues no longer matter in the party. It is pure. The only issue that matters is Donald Trump himself. And so the faction that is on the Nikki faction, whatever you want to call it, is aligned on the idea that they're not that into Donald Trump. Now, Mitch McConnell, one of the reasons why I respect the guy is he doesn't want to be president, which is remarkably rare in the modern era for senators. He likes the institution of the Senate. And he's a grown-up. Now, at the same time, he's also a cold-eyed reptilian realist. And so his reasoning for endorsing Trump has to be a very pragmatic calculation. I'm kind of curious to know exactly what it is. What is Trump giving him in exchange for McConnell, bending the knee one more time? I don't have a lot of clarity on that. But I don't think that we're going to see Mitch McConnell become, Matt Gaetz in his adoration of Donald Trump in any way.
Yeah. As it, Tara mentioned 40%, which is the number that Nikki Haley got in the South Carolina primary. And that's not an inconsiderable number. That 40% is something. It's not nothing. On the other hand, she's the sole credible challenger left. And it was in her home state that twice elected her governor. So should we see 40% as a big number or as a small number?
I think in the end, we'll see it as an inconsequential number. I think it'll be just a kind of, it's a point of kind of pride for Nikki Haley, I think, to beat those expectations. But I think from the beginning of this primary to now, Donald Trump has been treated as the incumbent by a large majority of the Republican base. You know, when we were out on Republican events last year, you could feel the shift among Republican voters. There was a kind of start of the year hangover from the midterms where people were pointing fingers at Trump, specifically around the question of electability and if he could win and if he was a drag on the party, partially by living in that 2020 conspiracy. But we saw that kind of tangibly shift as the indictments came down, as people started to rally around him and really kind of tether their own conservative identity more closely to his. And I think that we have seen basically, Nikki Haley suck up some energy that may have gone to DeSantis or other candidates before, but we're not seeing that eat into Donald Trump's share. And so I think I think that should be our overwhelming takeaway here, is that whether or not there is a slice of the party that is or is not with him, they are not made it difficult really to overcome. And more so, we are seeing when we talk to those Nikki Haley supporters, I was just with a ton at a watch party in New Hampshire right before that primary, state where she did well. They're all aligned that they would vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden in November, right? Even though they very clearly articulate an anti-Trump position in the primary. So I do think that there is a larger question of electability that still lingers around him. But for the primary context and for the context of the panel about the future of the Republican Party, I think we can safely say that remains in Donald Trump's image.
You mentioned the indictments of Donald Trump, which people who have been around for a while thought would be a bad thing politically, to be indicted on 91 felony counts. But it turned out to be a good thing in terms of solidifying Trump's support in the party. If he had not been indicted in some alternative version of history, would he be in this commanding position for the nomination, do you think?
I think it's an interesting what if. I know people like DeSantis have tried to make that argument. I'm someone who actually thinks that there was a lot of Republican coordination around the Trump challenger. It just happened to be that challenger hadn't been vetted in a real national way and had real kind of serious structural problems with both them as candidate and campaign. So, I think that Donald Trump's indictment certainly helped him, and being treated as that incumbent certainly changed the narrative of the race. But I also think that DeSantis' own kind of flatness helped Donald Trump. And that was the candidate that was most threatening in terms of being able to pull together a larger coalition. When we were talking to Trump kind of campaign folks at the beginning of last year, they would take a one-on-one with Nikki Haley every day of the week, And so it actually ended up developing in a way that certainly benefited, I think, kind of the electoral angle in the primary. But to your point, there was a shift among voters. There was a shift among conservative media. There was a rallying around him that took place, certainly driven by the indictments. I think that interesting what if the order was different too is a question that comes up. And it wasn't the kind of Alvin Bragg case that came up first. That was easier for them to paint as or characterize as political.
So I agree with pretty much all of that. I think there's a missing variable, though, to it, insofar as it wasn't just that there was this rally around Trump effect from the indictments. I do think the order, I think the Bragg indictment was seen as the most political and kind of desperate, and that helped delegitimize future indictments. But the key factor here is that Donald Trump's opponents didn't use the indictments against him. Instead, they ratified this idea that Trump was a victim. They ratified this idea that if you're part of our tribe, you have to be against this, even if this is a really good excuse to say, hey, maybe we should try a different candidate, right? And so it's the fear of the irrational response of Trump fans that got sort of in the heads of a lot of these candidates. And partly, I think, DeSantis in particular, because he had a really weird strategy of trying to win over Trump voters first.
Yeah.
And winning Trump voters first, you have to sort of say, oh, the Biden regime is doing this outrageous thing. And once you say that, you're basically giving a permission structure for everybody to say, well, they're attacking our guy, they're attacking our avatar, we have to rally around him. So it was a 1-2 punch. It was the indictments plus the refusal of his competitors to say, whoa, there's something here and this is bad. And DeSantis would do very weak tea kind of attempts at this and then retreat. And so it was that secondary legitimization of the victimization narrative that I think sealed the deal.
And that's part of the reason why the primary contest was never really a contest from the beginning, because the opponents were too busy justifying Donald Trump's position. They weren't running against him. They were agreeing with him. And then because that was part of the loyalty test for Republican primary voters. So the dynamic here was very strange. I said from the beginning that it was the greatest reality show competition for second place, because they never went after him for the legitimate problems. I mean, never mind everything else that was problematic about Donald Trump, mainly what he did during his presidency. And then obviously January 6th and the big lie, denying the election was free and fair of Joe Biden. Never mind all of that. They were tripping over themselves to say who would pardon Donald Trump, for goodness sakes, if he were convicted of any of the 4 criminal cases against him in the 91 counts that were all legitimate. I feel very strongly that the Alvin Bragg case going first did hurt that argument, unfortunately, because it was seen as the most political, whereas the other cases were a lot easier to understand, more relevant, and I think they should have been more problematic given the nature of the charges. So it gave them that opening to say that, oh, everything is tainted. Everything, the Justice Department and the justice system is somehow now rigged against Donald Trump, which was in line with his undermining of many institutions that Republicans used to respect, including the justice system.
Governor DeSantis started out with a lot of hopes behind him, a lot of money behind him. He turned out to be not a very good candidate who didn't do very well. Just quickly, is there anybody who could have run for this nomination who didn't run, who could have done better than the field that ran? Is there anybody in your mind that, boy, if they had decided to take on Trump, we might be having a different story? Nobody?
Who? I mean, Ron DeSantis, the idea of Ron DeSantis, I always thought was laughable. I mean, I worked in Capitol Hill when he was a congressman, and he was not a popular guy then. He was kind of the Ted Cruz of the House. Nobody really liked him. He was
those are damning words.
It was true. Find
it's
someone
better than the Rand Paul of the House, but
maybe it's arguable. But he opened his mouth, and then people saw how awkward and arrogant he was as a candidate, and he imploded relatively quickly. I think if Nikki Haley had decided to take a position and not flip-flop and try to be all things to all people, she might have given Donald Trump a run for his money more so in the beginning. But no one was willing to take Donald Trump on head on and condemn him for being not only an apostate for traditional Republican values, but also just on the issue of democracy, on the issue of going after our institutions, on the issue of criminality. All of these things were openings to say this is not the future of our party, and to show that he was a loser for the party. Take away all the principles, just from the pure numbers, he's been a loser for the party. And unfortunately, elected officials, they don't change or respond until they start losing power. Mm-hmm. And I guess they haven't paid enough of a price yet to decide that Donald Trump is a loser for them.
I would just say, in fairness to Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, they did try to make those arguments.
True.
But that also shows you the real headwind here is, I know we're all supposed to say only the most lofty and wonderful things about democracy, but sometimes the voters are wrong. And the Republican primary voters had a deep and abiding, really deep emotional commitment to Donald Trump. And that, it's not an accident. Donald Trump says that they're coming for me to go after you. Yep. That emotional connection, as deranged as I think it is real.
It's powerful.
And, I agree with you that Nikki could have been a little more aggressive, but at the same time, one of the reasons she lasted this long is because she was threading this needle, which just was inadequate to the headwinds.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that I think it's important to, I not only see kind of MAGA and the relationship between Trump and base as an emotional, which, there is an element of that, and it's certainly more so than relation to any other candidates. And I think it's because MAGA sees itself as a movement, right? And I think that those are actually value-aligned things, and there's substance aligned to that sometimes I think we can underrate. I remember last year at the Republican winter meeting in Dana Point, this is right after the midterm elections, one big kind of Trump radio host who, Trump has been on the show 50-something times. I was asking him, Trump looks kind of down right now. Is there an opening for a DeSantis? Is there an opening for those other folks? And, he made the point about how the intentional the MAGA intention is to upset elites, is to, disrupt system, is to, invoke fear in so-called deep state, whatever. And so some of the candidates who are on that slate, none of those are going to do that same thing, right? And so I think we should actually align the policy promises with Trump this time with some of this, right? And I think we can sometimes act as if voters are backing him, Republican primary voters are backing him in spite of the promises to weaponize the justice system or to do the mass deportation ever, or to, install federal judges that are going to act in certain ways. But it is actively because of that in a lot of instances. And so I don't think that we should overrate just Trump the person and forget that Trump the person has aligned himself with a worldview that a lot of those Republican voters are actively taking.
I don't know that if someone else had come along and espoused those same things, would it be as impactful? I mean, no one has been able to defy the rules of political gravity the way Trump has. So I think the cult of personality that Trump brings to this is a main reason why Trumpism is so popular, because he was able to, yes, was there a penchant for this apparently within the Republican Party that we underestimated? I certainly did. It absolutely unearthed parts of the Republican Party I didn't think existed in such large numbers, which is partially why I left it. So they obviously were open to this type of authoritarian talk and this type of I think it's populist, illiberal populism, nationalism that's very dangerous. But Donald Trump's cult of personality is unlike anything we've ever seen. And we've been warned in the past about how that is incongruent with democracy. And I think we're starting to see the byproducts of that right now. And the American people have a choice. Republican primary voters seem to be okay with that, which I think that stark contrast is what the American general electorate is going to face come November.
The first president I covered was Ronald Reagan, and he had this three-legged stool of the Republican Party, famously. None of those legs really apply to the Republican Party anymore. If you were going to describe apart from Trump, but as you were saying, Asted, if you were going to describe the three-legged stool of today's Republican Party, or the fundamental things that define the GOP today, what would they be?
I'll tell you the issues we hear most about would be, I would think, a desire to punish enemies. I would say retribution, as Donald Trump describes it, I would say is active part of that stool. I would put a rejection of foreign policy establishment or an isolationism that's often expressed as America first in that stool. I think I would put, and that would include a border element that I think it mostly includes illegal immigration domestically, but also China. And then I would probably do what we now would describe as economic populism alongside that. So if I were making the three-legged stool again, I would include the kind of populist streak that I think we associate with Trump mostly in 2016. I would include an America first global worldview that includes both border, immigration, and kind of a strong but isolationist government. And I think the other part would just be how government should work. And I think there is a belief that enemies should be punished, and that's okay. And I think that is more of an active choice than we give often credit to in the Trumpism worldview.
Hey, Jonah, does that sound like your three-legged stool for the party today?
No, in part because, and I don't mean this as a hostile response, I kind of reject the premise. And so far as one of the things about the old three-legged stool thing was that, the economic conservatives, the social conservatives, and the foreign policy conservatives, each of them found something reflected in their own worldview in the other two legs, right? There was a philosophical consistency. If you were a social conservative, you believed you had this patriotic notion of traditional America that put itself at odds with communism, right? And that it was part and parcel of the entrepreneurial spirit of America, and vice versa. They all sort of bolstered each other in a certain way. And that's what an ideologically unified party looks like. I don't disagree that there's all sorts of demons and psychological, weirdness in the Republican Party today. I just don't think it forms anything like a coherent ideological program. I've been arguing, for almost 10 years now that Trumpism is better understood as a psychological rather than a political phenomenon. And I think, if we're going to talk about the future of the Republican Party, which is very opaque to me, and I think all honest people should have room for a certain amount of epistemological doubt about how good our predictions are going to be about the future of the Republican Party. But one of the things I took some solace from was that if you watch the debates, and it was actually kind of edifying that Trump wasn't there in a way, with the exception of Vivek Ramaswamy, who I believe was designed in a German lab to create a candidate I could hate more than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But with the exception of Vivek, all the other candidates fell back on basically Reaganite arguments. Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson, Ron DeSantis. You will look at Ron DeSantis's ads. It's a lot about freedom and all of these kind of Reaganite themes. And the natural default language of the Republican Party remains that stuff when Trump isn't in the room distorting everything. And that seems to me a good feedstock or a seed stock for what a post-Trump Republican Party can look like. Because every time, and I spend a lot more time following conservative ideological stuff than I do political Republican stuff. Every single time some egghead tries to come up with a coherent, philosophically and ideologically consistent doctrine to fit onto Trumpism, it doesn't take long for them to look like a fool because Trump has none.
Right.
And
He's
so
nihilist.
He brags about how he just goes on instinct. And like, so right now, one of the last legs of the old, Reagan coalition, which was essentially the pro-life movement. Every serious pro-lifer I know is white-knuckled with fear that Trump is going to throw them all under the bus because he's captured all of these movement institutions followers for himself. And so he thinks, abortion is a losing issue for him in the election, and he's right.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's going to come up with something that is going to beclown all of these people who insist that he's a passionate Christian pro-lifer, which is he's done to every other intellectually consistent faction on the right over the last 6 years because he just doesn't care about ideology.
But he will have done that after installing a Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade. Let's look to the future of the
But he did that for transactional reasons, and I no longer think he thinks he has to obey any transactional consideration.
But once you've overturned the constitutional protection, it matters less what you're going to do in your proposal. Anyway, this is a conversation for a different panel. Let's talk about the future of the Republican Party. Tara, Jonah's kind of optimistic that it'll return to normal once Trump leaves the scene, which he at some point will do. Are you optimistic? What to talk about?
Just to be clear, I think it's possible. I'm not predicting that it will definitely happen.
Well, you're a naturally optimistic, sunny person, I know.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Tara, what do you think? When you think about the future of the Republican Party, where do you see it going after Trump?
I think that as long as Trump is living and breathing, there is no future for the Republican Party that is anything reminiscent of what the party that Jonah is talking about, or that I grew up on, or that you covered, Susan. The party of Reagan, I think, is pretty much already dead and buried. The idea, we were talking about Mitch McConnell earlier, coming out and endorsing Donald Trump after everything that's transpired, I think solidifies the obituary of the Republican Party. I would argue that once the party allowed Donald Trump to get away with January 6th, was a constitutional potential crisis and something we had never seen in history before, with the interruption of a peaceful transfer of power. Once they still made excuses for him there, to me, that was the end of the Republican Party as we know it. And I think it needs to be burned to the ground and started over. There is no help in salvaging or wish casting that the party of Reagan or Bush or Jack Kemp, who was a personal hero of mine, or the conservative movement that Bill Buckley envisioned will ever come back, because a lot of those intellectual conservatives are no longer either welcome in the Republican Party, or they've completely sold out and have become intellectually dishonest. Because if they were intellectually honest, we wouldn't have this mess right now. There are a lot of enablers in the Republican Party who know better and still do, Mitch McConnell being one of them, that have allowed pure political expediency and power to throw those principles out the window, and now have allowed this demagogue to take over. And so I don't see a future for the Republican Party that looks anything like what we used to see with the people who are currently involved. is there hope for something else to come out of it? A right of center party? I would hope so. I mean, I'm politically homeless as of right now. You have the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Kinzingers and others who have spoken out and have been steadfast, and God bless them. But it's going to take a whole lot more people to get together to try to form something new. But the current Republican Party, I feel the malignancy of Trumpism renders it dead as far as any potential future for it.
So that's a somewhat more pessimistic look than our sunny Jonah Goldberg Davis. Let's go to Asen. Let me ask you, who decides what Trump eventually leaves the scene? We don't know this year. Maybe he runs again, loses, runs again. But there's a point when the party, when he will not be that of the party, who then decides, or even maybe not after this election and looking forward, who decides the future of the Republican Party? Who has the power to shape what it then stands for?
I mean, I think Trump is a really instructive answer to this. He would not be here if the Republican Party top down decided, right? Like, we should think of this as a party that has already been overtaken by grassroots, and if we use those prisms. And I think that we should think of that as the group of people who would select the next version of the Republican Party. And so that's why I think that it often is hard for me to kind of see that universe. One, I don't think we should presuppose the idea that he loses in November, right? And if the man is president again, then certainly all of these bets are off. Then looking forward, even if he were to lose, I think this is going to be a year where the Trump campaign in its kind of 2024 strategy, as it expresses, when we ask them, is planning to, plant seeds of a realignment, right? They're going to reach out to new types of people under the knowledge that they cannot win traditional, what we would consider conservative slices of electorate. So I think that we're going to see some shifts in what I think we should identify with what these parties' bases look like. And so in that view, I agree kind of with what was said previously. I think the Republican Party is already, if we think of the Reagan version, died. And so I think that we are in the start of a rebirth. And so I don't know what that looks like. And I certainly think that outside of Trump, there will be new folks but I think that the imprint is such where we should already think of those traditional party structures of having been eroded. Right? There is a reason he can now install his daughter-in-law at the top of the RNC. Like, it is already over. And so that's how I'm saying is I think we should think of that transition as important. And we're seeing there's a reason they're paying his legal bills, right? Like, we should already think of ourselves as in this new moment.
We're almost out of time, but just very quickly, is there a credible chance for a third party, a center-right party that Tara, for instance, would like to join? Just very quickly around the horn. Jonah, could that happen?
Richard Hofstadter, the famous political historian, he had the famous line that third parties are like bees. They have their effect by stinging and then they die. The constitutional structure of our elections make it very difficult to have a lasting multi-party, more than two-party system. So I do think there's a possibility that a third party, the times have never been more propitious for one in terms of the desires of the vast majority of American people to have a different choice. But the structural impediments to it are really profound, and third parties tend to reward the parties they dislike the most.
I want to be clear. I'm not talking about a third party. I'm talking about replacing the Republican Party, because I think that third parties, to your point there, that's not going to work in our current system. So just to be clear, especially not this time around. No labels. I'm talking to you people.
Let's close. We started this conversation with who the Republican nominee would be in 2024. And everybody agrees that barring some almost impossible to imagine circumstance, some very cataclysmic thing, it's going to be Donald Trump. Who do you think the Republican nominee is going to be in 2028? Tara, do you want to go first?
Well, I think that if Donald Trump wins, that we may not have a traditional election or system in 2028. I firmly believe he's an existential threat to our democratic system and institutions. And people need to wake up to that possibility. He's already said it when he's bragging about this. His people brag about if he comes in, he could be president for life. They're trying to erode those institutions. Project 2025 is something that they want to restructure the way our federal government works. I'm very concerned about what 2028 would look like if Donald Trump were to be elected again. So I don't know who could possibly emerge in 2028 because, I mean, John Adams warned us that all democracies eventually commit suicide. And I think that if Donald Trump is reelected, that's exactly what will happen in ours. So I don't really know who that could be in 2028. I'm worried about if we even have elections free and fair in 2028.
Well, that's very sobering. Jonah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't completely rule out that it'd be Nikki Haley, but I wouldn't bet that way. I think if Donald Trump wins the election, I think the Republican nominee in 2028 will be whoever Donald Trump had picked as his vice president, because by 2028, that person will be president, because I think Trump will be removed from office if he actually gets elected.
Well, those are two really dramatic scenarios for what we have ahead.
Still, mine's rosier than hers.
Well, reality. That's what we're facing.
Okay, we're going to give you the last word. So look ahead, 2028. What do you see?
I do think the stakes are that big. So I don't want to say I'm outside of what they say, but I would say it's someone not in Washington. I think the movement decides, and I'm using movement in quotes because I don't think that they should be taken literally as such, but I do think it's important to think about this as a bottom-up driven party rather than the top-down. And I think that someone outside of the traditional political structure, if I was taking lottery picks, I would pick Tucker Carlson a lot higher than I would pick Tim Scott. I would pick people who are in the kind of a-traditional, preachy, Trump-esque Vivek Ramaswamy. I would take Marjorie Taylor Greene over, insert even Nikki Haley, to be honest.
This is quite a remarkable conversation. 3 smart people and 3 apocalyptic predictions about what's ahead in our politics. Well, thank you all for being with us. Jonah Goldberg, Tara Setmeyer, Asted Herndon. Thank you for being with us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.